And let's see if this is working. Evening all, evening all. All right then. Hello everyone. Let's see if this is working. Now, what you all will not know, but I am going to try and keep pace with the questions as I put them up, because I have it on my phone. But eventually, when I have this running properly, I am going to need to buy, I think, a second screen, literally, so I can run it, and probably have my PC running probably 2 screens. But this is actually run from the laptop, because I found the new software, once I did a few tricks and played around with it, would actually run properly on the system. So, hello everyone. Hopefully this is working. Right then, hello Jack Ray, hello Carl, hello Jay Richardson, hi Jeff, hi John, hi Night Heron Productions, hi Banhan, hi Albert, hi Kevin. Thank you very much, Kevin. Yes, I definitely am mortal. Occasionally people try and suggest otherwise. I have to remind them I certainly am mortal. And let's see if this is working. It looks like it is to me, from the little screen I have running up there. But that is it. So, tell me if you can see me, if the things are working. Please do say. If I freeze too much, tell me. I want to know, because I'm trying not to. It should be okay. Hello everyone. Right then, interesting enough, yeah, that's all good. Working for you. Do you need someone whispering, remember you are mortal in here when you're on the live stream? Sound and video seem to be working too. That's good. I have live stream now working properly on my phone. I did have fun with the chat there for a second. It was on top chat mode rather than live chat mode. Right, so. 'Tis Francis' fault. Hello, my friend. It's been a while, but it's good to see you back. Right then. So the advantages of this system, if it works and continues to work, which it hopefully will do, are that, of course, I have my PowerPoint slides next to me. And again, it's going to follow the same sort of formula as the introductions. The introductions went into one set of detail, but believe it or not, the slides I saved for the live, if in case this worked, have a little bit more in them. Just a tad. Again, I want to make my Bilge Pumps song and dance, because Bilge Pumps is a lot of fun. We recorded an episode on China this morning, and it was 70 minutes of us having a lot of fun recording it. It's a lot of so if you guys enjoy it, we're going to keep it going, because it's a lot of fun. Right then. Hello, Brock Payne. Hello, Rabbit. Brazeback. I do like that idea. Turn guns around. Here's the thing: the guns could turn around. It's one of the myths that they couldn't. The thing was, they'd been supplied with armor-piercing rounds, not with enough high explosives, so they couldn't really do much. So that is one of the reasons why I say you have to sort of clear certain areas, because you need to make sure what rounds you do have hit their targets. Disposable. Well, if you do drink Coke rather than Iron Brew, you have to expect that it might destroy your Wi-Fi router. Kemba Tag, 17 or 70 minutes? 70 minutes on China today. Oh. Yeah, you know, we mainly are polluting the noise waves more than the airwaves, but it works. Right then. Let's see. Why Malaysia and Singapore matter? It's the first real question you have to ask. Why even defend this point? Well, it's kind of like Taiwan and China in the current position it's in. If you want to defend the Indian Ocean, you need to be able to link your forces in India and Australia. That is what you need. And if you have your base on Singapore, you can A, get into the South China Sea and up to Japan quite easily, but also you have an advantage in that you've still got an island chain, i.e. the lovely islands of Java and other parts of the Philippines, between you and the Indian Ocean. So if the enemy do get past you, they are not in for a fun time. And it's one of those things, if you have control of Singapore and the Japanese do a Operation C, they might get into the Indian Ocean, they're not getting out of it, because there will be submarines waiting for them, and they will go, "Hello, Mr. Carrier. So good to see you. You've come for my special service. That's 10 missiles 10 torpedoes in one salvo. Happy days for me." You know, it's a thing. It's a strategic point. Right then, let's go through these questions quickly. HE in Singapore depot. There wasn't enough. That's the trouble. Stingross, read the Singapore guns. It was 6 times 15-inch guns, and was there any other weapons? There were some other weapons with them as well. There were other artillery systems. There were other things as well there. It's a strategic choke point. That's correct, Osprey. Tony Penfield, Lord Wellington. You will be suggesting use of canister next. Well, you know, you are facing enough Japanese soldiers. Canister might work. God, that's right. Prince of Wales repulsed berthed in Johor Strait as Japanese army approached Sheldon with 14-inch and 15-inch shells fought. That would work, but in the nicest way, if your battleships are berthed in those straits, then frankly, in the harbour, then there's not the whole purpose is out, really. If you have them there, your only real option is to withdraw them or attack with them, which is why I say they should have been based in Ceylon. It would have made life so much easier. Well, Sri Lanka as it is these days. Sure, Mac. One thing that we did in the PBM of War in the Pacific that I told you about a couple of streams ago, we took a few squadrons of AFG and put them in Singapore. It was a nice surprise. Wonder if it would. It would certainly be interesting. There's all sorts of surprises you could have drawn in Singapore. I see one. Looking at the major transport lines in the world, IATA runs right through Singapore. Yeah. Forcing Japanese raider subs and fleet the long way around to get to the Indian Ocean is a huge logistical cost for them. Yes. And Martin, RF were building airfields and not consulting the army, who they just expect to defend them. Brooke Popham clueless and past it. Gang, hello, Carl. Well, yes. We're going to get on to Brooke Popham. We're going to get on to various people. Sorry. Because, frankly, I know I didn't discuss them in the introductions videos, but I had a reason for it, and I thought it was better to say it for this one, especially if this worked. But I wanted you all to have an idea of Malaya, of where Singapore is, of how it matters. What is the purpose of stationing them in Ceylon for interaction? It's the next biggest port back, which can take them, and they can get from there to Singapore. So basically, if they're based in Ceylon, you can force your force up, and as I'll get into this, you can form your fleet up to a proper fleet, and then turn up with a proper fleet instead of dashing in with what you have available, which frankly isn't much and is a bit embarrassing. Ian Carr, when was a ramping up of tensions in the Far East, which was likely to involve the UK, realistically happening? The British were looking at it pretty much being in the 1940s. They have lots of plans. Hello, Pat W. Hi, Paul Johnson. Would have been better if the Prince of Wales and Repulse had met up with the Abda forces in the region and worked with them, even if that probably meant putting Dorman in a position of control them. Dorman wouldn't have been in a position of control them. If, in a nicer way, Prince of Wales and Repulse are still alive and still working, then Phillips is still there. In which case, I'm sorry, but the Admiral is in charge. You might be a Commodore or whatever your rank is, but I'm an Admiral of the Royal Navy, would be Tom Phillips' response, and it wouldn't have worked. Besides, Tom Phillips had one of the greatest episodes of short man syndrome known to mankind. He basically made Richard Hammond look like he was a moderate, quiet personality. I agree that the army should have pulled back to a strong defence line. Batu to Mersing seems like a decent-ish starting point. The terrain is a swine, though. Terrain is a swine throughout Malaya. I was literally looking for a point which could be theoretical defendable, and I picked that point because theoretically you've got some support coming, and you can have quite easy on-call air support from Singapore air bases. Right then. Don Fritz, you're on the Sea Control podcast. I've been on HC History for the past few months. Oddly enough, the last episode I think covers this, but more Clark and Drac is like awesome. Yes, Sea Control podcasts were what I originally, and I've done a whole load of Falklands Sea Control podcasts, etc., that they did when I was in charge of the East Atlantic side. Right, so I'm going to hold that there while I move this on. So, the traditional outline. 70,000 strong 25th Army of the Imperial Japanese Army invades Malaya on the 8th of December 1941, and by the 15th of February 1942, they have routed and destroyed a Commonwealth force of 86,000 troops. Well, for starters, this is the British positions, and they're quite well laid out, but actually I like doing this with this map, so I'm going to leave it like that. The British, as you can see, are spread out like no one's business. They are trying to defend Kuala Lumpur. They're trying to defend everywhere, and it just isn't going to work. So, you have a real problem with them trying to defend, everywhere. And you can tell what the better terrain is on Malaysia, because that's where their forces are linked in and their forces are together. And this is the existing plan. You've got the division structured up mostly up the west coast of Malaysia, which is where the vast majority of the good links and the good roads and the good transport infrastructure is. And they slowly fall back to Johor and then to Singapore. And frankly, it's, Third Corps is based on Kuala Lumpur. That's where they're sort of run from. And this is what happens. They get rather conclusively smashed. And you can see some points where, especially the Australians, put up a fairly good fight. But there's just not much chances here. There's not much chance in this. It's not really a good scenario for anyone to try and fight in. The whole point is that the command is rather disjointed. And the ideas are rather disjointed. There is a lack in the Far East of some sort of authority to really coordinate things properly. Seems to me that Singapore is a stopgap place to hold so Japanese don't attack Australia. Bingo, that's another thing. If you hold Singapore, you make quite a lot of attacks on the Philippines, on Australia, into the Indian Ocean. Basically, if you can control Singapore, you can stop them having a lot of... you can keep the Japanese under sort of far stronger, far more limited. Also, be nice to set up HQ infrastructure there as opposed to Singapore. In Sure, Mac, I think I've missed part of your conversation. I doubt I would set up stuff in Ceylon. As a further past. Singapore is a good place to set up your headquarters if you can. Myself, I have a feeling if I had been, oh, well, we'll get on to that when we're talking about the things that didn't happen. How my answer would be down. Talk about that one. Right. Jeff Beeler, Brooke Ponton wanted to preemptively invade Thailand, attack the Japanese invasion fleet en route to Thailand, but diplomats and ultimately Churchill will not let him. Ultimately, Brooke Ponton was lovely at putting forward all sorts of ideas, and frankly, British Far East Command. So, Robert Brooke Popham is one of the biggest wastes of space in the Far East, as far as I'm concerned. He is only in command of the Army and Navies, and even then it's sort of the very weak coordinating sort of command. And oh goodness gracious me, he isn't. He's got such a large area to look after, and he keeps talking. He talks a big game. He talks all these things, like Jeff Beeler's pointed out. He talks a game, and then the diplomats and Churchill and these things wouldn't let him. But also, he's not got the forces to do it. You cannot go offensive with the forces he has. He has, frankly, forces which, I wouldn't take offensive in a million years. You know, if I was going to go offensive in the nicest way, I'd want forces which were trained up to actually do offensive operations. Not what Brooke Popham has and is talking about taking on an offensive. It's just... It's absurd, some of the stuff he comes up with and goes, oh yeah, I want to go this, I want to do this, I want to do that. And you're going, no, you can't. You just can't, Brooke. And he is... Oh, so problematic. He doesn't have the aircraft. He doesn't have anything that he can do this idea of. I can engage the Japanese fleet as they're coming. I can defend these air bases. He is the one who pushes for half those air bases to be built in the first place. If you cannot get the aircraft out there, if you do not have the aircraft, there is absolutely no point in having the freaking air bases. None. At all. Sorry. I am going to have to tell you about Admiral Phillips in a bit. Where was the Japanese battleship forces? Yamato is still fresh and green. Basically, most of the Japanese battleship forces are actually still in Japan area. They're not really down supporting these operations. Hi, King George V. Golden Eagle No, they didn't. The Hurricanes turn up later. We'll talk about this later. They had buffaloes out there. You can look them up. I'll discuss them in a second. They got Hurricanes later. Yes, I am going to tell you how I keep Prince of Wales alive. British expected anyone to fight like them. Discount the jungle. No. The British did not discount the jungle. The British knew how blooming deadly the jungle was. The British had the Gurkhas down there who were also jungle certified. I love this one. And again, the Destroyer's history. The only jungle certified unit is the Argylls. No, there's a Gurkha brigade down there which are jungle certified. There are 2 Malayan units who are made up of locals who are very experienced operating in the jungle because they're mostly poor country boys who have been recruited. The British do have jungle experienced troops down there and jungle experienced officers. They're just not used as they could be. Too far down the Japanese Air Force operating from Thailand and northern Malaysia can easily attack anything coming down the Straits of Malacca. It can in theory, but in practice, if what's coming down is what I'm planning on coming down, and you've got the support from Singapore, it ain't going to be attacking that well. And also, you can do stuff about those airfields in northern Malaysia. Jeff Beeler, British not have decent air organisation. It was designed to train, not to fight things. It was designed by Air Chief Marshal Robert Brooke Popham. That thing on the left. No, he's just ineffective. He's like most of the officers sent out to the Far East. Frankly, you wonder where they got them from. There you go, because my head keeps getting chopped. Move that way a bit. All right. So, I'm still getting used to where to put that. So, I'm sorry if moving it disturbs anyone. Located. Ian Carr, should the Japanese landing forces have been located by ships, aircraft, or Coast Watch? Probably by Coast Watch and aircraft, not ships. Third Corps should have been up on the Thai border. No. No. They shouldn't have been. If you have them, nice way, if you have them too high up there, they're just going to get wiped out. Jim Hart, Chandler Christian, is this sparse offense in the line of thinking of yes, there's one ship, but you know what it represents? It is, but it's not really actually properly a thing behind it. Usually what you do then is you send a very small ship, a cruiser or something even smaller to do that. If you send a battleship, it kind of suggests that all you can send are that battleship. The battleship is rather too powerful to use for that. Jeff, wait a second. I'm going to explain these things. Right, and I've lost. There's a whole lot of questions coming. So, let's start off with Air Chief Marshal Popham is actually replaced halfway through December by Lieutenant General Henry Pownall. And yes, there are some actual history books which refer to Henry Brooke Popham and manage to confuse them to both because they are so important to history. Hey, caramba. Right. Let's go back to the forces you have available, because I prefer this one. So, the forces in the army, you have the Indian Third Corps. You have the Indian, which is made up of the 11th Infantry Division, the 9th Infantry Division, a line of communications brigade. Then you have the Australian Division, and you have all these sort of independent battalions defined between Crocol and Fortress Penang. Fortress Penang is the most silly name for a place ever known to mankind. And then you have the Fortress Singapore Division, which has some more brigades, and you have a third brigade in Singapore. So you have quite a lot of forces around there to train up. Now, let's go see. Percival arrives in April 1941. He is still complaining about the lack of training of his troops in December 1941. In the nicest way, yes, you might have a governor, yes, you might have issues with Churchill and all these things, but you have been in charge and are the Lieutenant General in charge of Malaya since April. So that goes April. Let's discount April. Let's just go May, June, July, August, September, October, November. You've had 7 months, man. You are a Lieutenant General. If you are in charge, do your job, issue some orders, get them training. But the trouble is, he knows he's a very good staff officer. He has a lot of staff experience. He's not a good experienced commander. Popham assumed many, many things. Jeff Beeler, most of the British have been in positions less than a year by December 7th. Brooke, Popham, Percival. Actually, the only one who that really counts for is frankly, I will defend on those grounds, is this guy. Because Phillips turns up on the 2nd of December. He is the only one who has any excuse for not knowing the scenario he's in. He literally turned up 6 days ago. That's it. He's turned up 6 days ago. I will forgive him so many of his sins because he turned up 2 days ago. Jeff Beeler, not those Gurkhas. No, those Gurkhas were quite well. It's, again, the 28th Gurkha Brigade, the 28th Brigade, right, man. So, that brigade is composed of all sorts of things, but in the nicest way. Their NCOs had been their officers had all been drawn from experienced units. They'd been together for roughly a year. they were actually fairly good. They were jungle qualified as far as anyone else was going to be in the nicest way, as far as British compares were. So, in the nicest way, it's very easy to talk them down, but they were jungle qualified. It's just they hadn't done the fancy course the Argylls and Sutherlands had apparently done, which, frankly, I'm not sure if the Argylls and Sutherlands had really done it properly either. Would it be fair to say the British leadership at the time were the C team? Honestly, I think they were the F team. Maybe the G. Possibly H. There are lots of more places getting more senior people than this. Brewster Buffaloes put up a much better performance when used by Finnish forces. Brewster Buffaloes would have been fine if they hadn't been spread around Japan, around Malaysia in penny packets. If we go, I think it's back. Right. So, these aircraft are spread between around 9 air bases. In the nicest way, there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 squadrons spread around 9 air bases. That's roughly an air base per squadron, almost. Nicest way, that's lovely and roomy, but you can't really do anything with it. And that means none of your aircraft. There were penny packets. I was looking at this. They were going, officially, 6 of the aircraft are here. But actually, 2 of the aircraft are here. And 2 are here. And 2 are here. And 2 are here. What are 2 Brewster Buffaloes supposed to do against the Japanese Air Force? What are 2? They can't do anything. I'm not sure who decided to divide them up around all those bases. But you can't do it. You don't have the forces to do it, so don't try. Concentrate them. At least divide between 2 air bases, one in Singapore, one in wherever, and try it from that direction. Richard Hughes, you disturb me, but I love it. I'm glad. Manga Special, what was the effective range for aircraft based on Singapore Island? Forward airfields might have been needed for refueling, even if no aircraft are based there. Honestly, no. Yes, you could use them for refueling, and yes, you could use them, but they did full-on air bases. They weren't building refueling air bases. They were building full-on air bases. And yes, you can say that, we can, but they were based up there. It's just, Dana Freeman, local forces raised in Malaya and Singapore better used as irregulars rather than as a formal force. They were under strength, like most of the forces out there, but they could have been used as regulars as well as irregulars. Jeff Healer, 3rd Corps Commander Lewis Heath had raised and led the 5th Indian Division in Ethiopia. One of his brigadiers was Slim, not a rear area type. No, he wasn't. But I don't, in the nicest way, 3rd Corps Commander, one of his brigadiers was Slim. Slim isn't out there. Let me just check a second. Yeah. 3rd Corps is commanded by Lewis Macclesfield Heath, and yeah, no Brigadier Slim. Just checking, because there wasn't. It's not, and he's got the 9th and the 11th divisions. He raised the 5th division, yes, out there, and he did have Slim, but he doesn't. In the nicest way, Macclesfield Heath is a bit past it as well in this scenario. But there are a lot of lieutenant generals out there. This is another problem. You have a load of lieutenant generals, and they're all wondering who's the senior officer. Why didn't they send in and support Operations Nagata class? They didn't need them. Right, so Percival, Phillips, the fall of Singapore. We're going to do this one quickly because, frankly, I want to. I prefer to get on to this discarding the what ifs than the other things. There went a large 15-inch short guns were installed in Singapore during the 1930s. That's when they're probably done. So, what is the source and myth about the Argylls? Do you know? Were they just particularly good at jungle fighting, or what? They were quite well trained. They did have a bit of experience, but they aren't the only force. It's not really a myth. It's just that they're the only British force which is jungle certified. The Australians were also fairly good at jungle warfare and fairly experienced at it and fairly knowledgeable. And in a nice way, that's why the Australians deliver one of the best fight backs. The trouble is they are led by Gordon Bennett, who is Gordon Bennett. It's just, Rapid Razorback. Anyone ever tell you that you have strong opinions if the officer in charge doesn't meet your standards? Yeah. In nicest way. Yeah. These are officers which could potentially have been very good, but they had a problem. They had a very big problem in that they're all much of a muchness, and there is no one out there who can really go, you need to do that, you need to do that. They need a leader out there. This is one of the things I started figuring out quite quickly. Donald Fritz, it seems Singapore is screwed from the start. Like, they can fight, but they aren't holding out forever. Maybe I'm wrong, but the only thing you can do is just make it and taking it hard. Actually, you could have made taking it darn near impossible. It's not screwed in any way. It's not a problem in any way. It actually can be quite easily secured, and frankly, it would want to be secured. That's the thing. The Americans, everyone would want to secure it very much. Let's do that. That's better. Right. Ian Carr, there seems to be a refusal in the RF to allow any Spitfires or many modern aircraft out of the UK by the end of 1941, despite considerable strength from the Luftwaffe concentrated on Russia. Yeah, there is. They don't want to lose them because they're worried about them. They need them. Percival should have been Heath's chief of staff. That might have been better. Heath might well have been better choice than Percival, but Heath was needed to try and form that corps up into a fighting formation. And there is a reason, though, I do consider him a good officer. But I think with the troops he has and the time he has available, I don't think he was put in a situation where he could do what he was able to do. UK and British tried to dogfight the Japanese aircraft that were seriously outclassed. The UK... the problem with the Brewster Buffalo was numbers. It wasn't that the pilots were outclassed. It wasn't that the pilots were terrible. It's their numbers. It's if you have two, it's Australians and British, which are manning. And if you have two very brave pilots versus 60 Japanese planes, as in one incident, unsurprisingly, the two very brave pilots, they might knock down 6 Japanese, but they get killed. I can't think why. But that was all that was at the airfield, so they took off the fight. It's just, you are... I'm not sure who's designed the plan here, but they're obviously one of those generals who Napoleon said, frankly, I don't want. There's the old story about Napoleon seeing a plan for defense of the border with all the troops laid out at nice, even intervals. And he looks at you and looked at the commander and went, that's terrible because they can break through anyway. This is what's happened to Malaysia. This is Malaysia's defense. Everything's been laid out at nice, neat intervals. Jeff Beeler is right. Most of the units had sent their good troops to the Middle East as reinforcements. The fighting in Iraq, the fighting in all over the place had really denuded the troops. Jeff Beeler, the diplomats and other civilians were bigger pieces and would not let the military do anything provocative like build defensive platforms. Plantations. Well, here's the thing. This is going to sound terrible. They wouldn't let D's military do it because D's officers would back down to them. And they would. There is no excuse, though, for the preparations. Well, no, sorry. If you had your pick of RN to serve the Far East question 941 while still covering German and Italian threat, what would you send instead of in place of 4C plus 1R class? I would have Warspite and Queen Elizabeth. If I didn't have to worry about the Germans and the Italians, while still covering German-Italian threat, I would still take Warspite and Queen Elizabeth and leave the Nelson and Rodney can deal with them. There's nothing else that's going to take on Nelson and Rodney they've got, and I'd leave them on the King George V, and I would take out Queen Elizabeth, and I would take out Warspite. I might still take the R-Class with me, because then at least I've got 15-inch guns for everything, so that makes my logistics a little easier. But we'll get into that in a second. Right then. Look at Wikipedia, look at Wikipedia on Singapore strategy, but not able to fully follow links. Planned in August 41 for HMS Barham and 4 R-Class plus Eagle to go to Far East, but somehow didn't go. No. Slim was then in Iraq. Yep. Hi, Kai. Tis for us all. Having some Matilda 2 wouldn't have gone amiss, and I'm thinking like 20 or so. Yeah. Right. How far... I don't know how far I am behind everyone on the questions, so I will try and catch up. But, yeah, Singapore... Oh, I've caught up. Paul Johnson, why weren't the commanders censored for the Monument of Failure, or is it just a case of establishment closing ranks? Most of them were captured by the Japanese, so no one was going to bother with censoring them. They had several years in jail cells in Japanese jails. That was more than enough censure. Yes. Well, Malaya's governor wouldn't allow the military to build defences, and Churchill's envoy, Duff Cooper, were at each other's throat. They were. There's all sorts of issues. There were no zeros in Malaysia. So, you know, the things would... the weakness of zero did not become apparent until one was captured by you. There were no zeros in Malaysia. It was all the older ones. Yeah, Gordon Bennett ran away. So, here's the counterfactual plan. Here's my options. And as I said, the criteria used is that I arrive on the 1st of April 1941 with the rank of Supreme... the person who is... I'm going to be picking... It arrives on the 1st of April 1941 as Supreme Commander, Commonwealth Forces Far East. So has control of all the naval and land forces. The forces available at the beginning are the same and will not have anything new brought into theatre. The simulation lasts till 28th of February 28th, 1942. I'm able to make limited personnel changes, but nothing massively dramatic. So I can't suddenly call in Slim, which would be beautiful, because if I could call in Slim, then I could win this battle. No, he'll be off running Burma in time. Simulation. Most of all, I cannot entertain any advanced knowledge of how the enemy will attack. So that was the real thing. How did I manage to think like that? Because, of course, I have all this knowledge. Goni, could the Chinese have helped? There was no China. In a nice way, China was fighting Japan as well as they could and being bushwhacked. There was no China at this time. Lions weren't being rushed to completion. They were never built. So, you know, there's no options on those ones. Would you have any CS for commerce raiding, Jeff Ealer? No, I wouldn't. I'd have left it with... Well, let me get into it. So, who could I be? There are only 3 officers which fit the rank, who can fit the role, who can control all 3 services, and fulfill the criteria of being friends with both John Curtin and Winston Churchill, and having their implicit support, so that they can, if necessary, overrule pesky governors, Gordon Bennett, and all sorts of other issues. DF, say the British-led forces hold Singapore. How do you supply it? I can imagine the needs are huge. It's not a sparsely populated area. They will eat and drink huge amounts. They will, but there are reasons for how you control it. And honestly, it's so valuable to control that the effort will be made to supply it. It's going to be slightly more difficult than mortal, but not impossible. The point is you have to control it. And also, in the nicest way, if you think about it, if you control Singapore, You protect Philippines, you protect Australia, you stop the Indian Ocean raid, you stop the Japanese, broadly speaking, getting into the Indian Ocean. So if you think about all those those benefits, you know, yes, the options are Percy Noble, Andrew Cunningham, or Roger Keyes. It's got to be Roger Keyes. Okay? He is the only one who's not involved in an active war command moment. He's head of combined operations. He is admiral of the fleet, so he is a 5-star, so he outranks anything that moves in the Far East completely without any qualms. And most importantly, Roger Keyes has never met anyone who will not do what he says, who doesn't get told to do what he says. If you want someone to take command of the Far East and actually have a chance of saving at least part of Malaya, saving Singapore, and fighting off the Japanese, it's got to be Roger Keyes. Also, there's the fact that his mere appointment would have probably made the Japanese think a bit harder. Because Roger Keyes is not MacArthur, he's not Nimitz. He is a known quantity as a massive leader, as a massive personality. He's also a former MP. He's a member of the House of Lords. He has all the politics down pat. He is the critical for it. Yes, yeah. We did manage to supply Tobruk, Malta. You know, if we need to, we can do it. Keyes is a bit old. He's you're going out as the Supreme Commander. Yes, he's a bit old, but honestly, on the scale of one, he's what's available at the moment. That's the trouble. If there had been Admiral Blackham or a couple of others ready, they'd have gone it. But honestly, Keyes, old maybe, but if you consider in 1944, he's running around American LSTs in the Far East, doing goodwill visits and chatting with them and getting involved and getting so close to the action he gets bombed by the Japanese. I don't think he's out of the count. I didn't go off on a rant about Phillips. No, I managed to skip past Phillips, but I will explain more about Phillips because I'll get to him in a second. Key's biggest asset is his political pull with Churchill. He needs a blank check because he was not going to get any other resources. Peacetime aviation commander. Yeah, basically he has a blank check, not just with Churchill, but with the Australian Prime Minister John Curtin. So Keyes, because John Keyes had been involved in various things in World War I, and he had managed to build up a good relationship with the Australians. So he's one of the few officers who could do this role. So yes, his age, but honestly, you accept that because of the other things. So, the general structure is, well, for this, I would take a look at what does Keyes do when he's in command of combined operations. He is obsessed with training. He basically sets up combined operations and the commandos. All these things are what he comes up with. And he is obsessed with training. So I could not imagine that with him put in charge in April 1941, with 6 months, 7 months to train the troops, those troops would have been trained in jungle warfare. They would have been as jungle warfare as possible. And, you know, nicest way, as Supreme Commander, you don't need to be a fresh-faced young person. You've got colonels and you've got admirals and lieutenant generals who can stay up all night for you. You need to be the leader, the big, powerful person. And come on, Roger Keyes. He's doing it. Naval forces. Well, again, if you go with Keyes with some of the plans he's doing, he's quite happy to risk old ships, but he tends to keep newer ships back and deploy them when they need. So, in a nice way, if he's got those forces, their naval forces are going to be building up on Ceylon. They're not going to be building up on Singapore because Keyes, again, if you look at how he approached when he was dealing with the Japanese and other people earlier in the interwar period, he would often keep his cruisers forward and his major ships back so that he could deploy his major ships when it suited him, not be dictated to by the enemy. So, and he was actually one of the people who came up with the defense plan for Singapore. And the other option was Twirt as well, who was also far even older, but I didn't think he could go it. So, you know, they had come up with a plan for defense of Singapore, and they would have kept the admirals back. What if you could keep alive Admiral Henderson as commander? That would have also fixed a lot of problems. And honestly, if he had been alive, he probably would have been the commander. And then you would have been dealing with a lot of things if you'd been Japan. All the sloops are on mine layer duty. All the cruisers are in the ocean as convoy escorts. Modern cruiser submarines are sent out of Singapore with both operating to cover approaches, so you can see the enemy coming. You've got Hong Kong, Singapore basically being extensively mined. Weihai Wei probably as well if you can get away with it. Air forces. All strike and fighters concentrate on Singapore under the cover of carrying out readiness enhancements. So basically you say, right then, you're coming here so we can upgrade you to the latest and make sure you're all perfect, so you're going to be down there. Admiral Ramsey is a bit... No. Nicest way, Admiral Ramsey is doing stuff with planning for D-Day and these things. This is the trouble. All these officers are very, very committed. I was looking for an officer who wasn't. So I know that in October 1941... Roger Keyes is replaced as Combined Operations by Lord Louis Mountbatten, and they can't really find another post suitable for him. I think this would have been a post suitable for him if it had been created at that time. Sean Macken, assuming he survives, he could be first Sea Lord, first post-war. Yes, well, that would be Henderson, definitely. If you could do. That's an interesting one. Would Henderson have been building ships in the Singapore facilities? Probably. You probably found a whole load of very small destroyers built, knowing him. Now, the reconnaissance aircraft I do keep dispersed on the airfields, because, again, Keyes is a very much a information person. He's very obsessed with getting information, so that's going to be his style. He wants to have information. And land forces. Well, you start, light forces will be left to hold the perimeter and border. Heavy units, everything, artillery, all that stuff, which is critical and which has been lost a lot of during the campaign, will be drawn to defensive lines. Again, under the cover of refits and things. And a proper defensive line will be built. Because, I will quote to you the words Roger Keyes said, and this might be not true, but it's definitely attributed to him, that when he was told that a facility he wanted built for the commandos couldn't be built because the local council was objecting, he apparently hit a mayor round the head hard, told them there was a war on, and built it anyway. So, it's sort of, this is the thing. If you've got Keyes out there, so many of these things get sorted out. Were there any operational submarines east of the Mediterranean? There were. We'll get into that in a second. So, what are the risks of this plan? Well, Japanese intelligence getting wind of the plans, own governments, and available officers. They are what they are. The work on infrastructure. Let's look at this properly. These are sort of defensive lines you're talking about. You've got a forward defensive line. That's on the main line, which was actually where they tried to construct one. Then you've got a southern defensive, a secondary defensive line, and then you have, of course, Singapore itself. Now, I did hear someone the other day was talking to me and going, well, what happens if the Japanese do an amphibious assault round it? What happens if they get away from get there? Well, if they do, you have a problem. But the odds are they don't, because in the nicest way, you can't just form an amphibious line, amphibious landing. You can't just pull them out of nowhere. And if they are going to pull them out of nowhere, they're going to be on the, let's say, the north eastern shore line, and so you can watch that. You can keep a good idea on it. And if you've got artillery deployed around those lines anyway, then you can hopefully stop them and hold them off. John Emmett, I feel like efforts in Singapore were reactionary and doomed following the loss of initiative. Likewise, Philippines. That is possible because, in simple terms, the commanders on the ground allow themselves to be dictated to by the Japanese and by the local politics, which is, again, why you need a supreme commander out there who isn't going to be dictated to by either of those things. Oh, we got up to 100 people in the live chat. Hello, everyone. I don't think he'd be able to arm them if he built them. Singapore wasn't awash with large guns. It was quite a problem. Actually, there was a little arms industry in Bombay. So, yeah, I think he could possibly have found something. This is Henderson we're talking about. He would have found something. There were lots of issues. Jeff B, the Japanese pulled 3 amphibious landings on the west coast. You need to make sure they do not capture any Penang. They do. They actually, and it's 1 amphibious landing, but they're landing in 3 places so they can divide the air support, so there'll be no air support for Force C. That's the whole thing. Why they're landing in 3 places. But those aren't really 3 opposed amphibious landings, and that's the thing. Doing an opposed amphibious landing versus an unopposed one is a very different scenario. John Emmett, MacArthur couldn't be dictated to by anyone, which was half the problem. There is a difference between Roger Keyes and General MacArthur. We will get into that at some point, but, hey-ho. Hard not offensive Singapore absorbs Japanese strength. Invasion of Java and strategic goal delayed. Yeah, it works, basically. So how would I deploy Prince of Wales? Well, let's get into them. So the formations. What do I have deployed? Well, you'll notice that I've transferred out the 28th Gurkha Infantry Brigade and brought them back to Singapore. Them, like the Australian Division, I am trying to protect. The Australian Division would go into the lines of defence, and the 9th Indian Division would go into the lines of defence. They are some of the stronger units. So actually, I want to retain them and make sure they survive any contact. So they're already in the defensive lines. That's good. So I've used the larger Indian Division, the 11th Infantry Division, as the ones out of the top. And I have very carefully made sure that my lines of defence, the outer ones, are under the direct command of Lieutenant General Lewis Macclesfield Heath. Now, the interesting difference is I have promoted Ivan Simpson to Chief Engineer for Malaya under the command of the Supreme Commander. So he reports only to me as Roger Keyes. In which case, yeah, you can build what you like, and anyone comes complaining, they have to come tell me off. And it's the thing is, if you have a proper defense line, and also then you have something for the 18th Infantry Division to slot into. You have the 44th and 50th. You have these 5 more brigades coming in. You can slot them in. You can actually build a proper force. You can slot them into the Singapore. You can slot them into the Singapore, and you can bring them up to the lines of defense. And you have something for the army units to withdraw back onto. And that's a big thing. The units will be withdrawing back onto it. Right now. The air forces. They're all being pulled back to Singapore. I cannot provide air defense over Malaya. But if you think about that formation, I can provide air defense over Singapore and over the defense lines of defense. With that force, I can provide air defense of that area. It won't be amazing. There will still be strikes getting through. The Japanese Air Force will still have a measure of air superiority, but they won't have unimpeded air superiority, and their strikes will be getting mucked up and will be being forced to, think about things. I will lose Bristol Blenheims. I will lose Buffaloes, but I should be able to keep enough going that once there's still an air force going, especially once the 30 Hurricanes arrive. And you must remember, the airfields north, the ones in Malaya, my plan is to mine them considerably. So, in the nicest way, they won't be able to be used by anyone by the time I'm finished. They will be death traps. Land your aircraft if you dare. Sorry. Yeah, if the hills could be entrenched, would be great cards. Basically, I'm drawing my idea from the lines of Torres Vedras. That's it. I'm copying Wellington. That's it. I'm being shameless about that. I'm completely honest. Now, Force Available. I have got my reaction fleet being based on Ceylon. And that is no longer Force Z, Force Z. The trouble is, when I said Force Z, it sounds like I'm saying Force Zod, which is why I've gone with Force Z. 3 battleships, Prince of Wales, Royal Sovereign and Revenge, and a battlecruiser, HMS Repulse. I've got that force would quickly, any convoys would be under the escort, of course, to light cruisers, and they'd be quickly drawn in. Now, I know HMS Exeter, we'll get to her in a second, what I've got her doing, and 11 destroyers. That's quite a big, potent force, okay? But here's the thing. At Singapore, I have cruisers going out doing what they're doing, trying to do the economic warfare. I have, hopefully, 6 submarines. After all, I'm Keys. I'm 6. I want 6 submarines. Roger Eamon is Keys semi-competent. That makes him 100 times better than MacArthur. Roger Keys is definitely very competent and very, very good. He's one of the most trusted and best admirals Britain has. And 6 torpedo boats. If I have this formation, I have Singapore doing economic warfare, but I also have some defences there. The thing is, if I can hold back my reaction forces to January, Indomitable will turn up. She's been delayed by both having a nice running aground and also the joys of actually getting aboard Sea Hurricanes and getting them worked up. If I'm Roger Keys, then probably I am screaming and shouting, in which case Formidable might well arrive early. There is a potential Formidable, so I could and then another battleship, Ramillies. So eventually, theoretically, if I manage to hold off the Japanese on those lines of defense till January, let's say mid-January, even maybe late January, then the fleet which turns up off the coast is 2 aircraft carriers, 4 battleships, a battle cruiser, 12 light cruisers, 15 destroyers. That's a huge force turning up off the coast going, the Navy is here! You better bring your fleet, because at that point, the Japanese have to either deploy the Kido Butai or their entire battle squadrons, everything, down south to take on the Royal Navy, or they have to withdraw, because that would be a huge number of 15-inch guns, a huge number of 14-inch guns, basically a huge fighting force turning up off the coast going, you haven't taken Singapore yet, and we've arrived now. You haven't got a chance. Go away. Bye-bye. The Japanese bypassed the Kuala defense line by performing a tactical landing, taking Indian division from the sea. Yes, they did. But there is a difference between doing that to an unprepared Indian division, which has been run into a position, than actually doing that to some prepared defensive lines, which have been sorted out and properly organised. Don't copy Wellington. That was Churchill's constant mistake. Two-dimensional thinking led to Greece. I'm not copying Wellington perfectly. I'm copying Wellington in terms of the idea of the lines of Torres Vedras, in that he had a far smaller, far less well-prepared military force against a far more experienced army. If you have these lines of defense and these things, you can actually provide them with some security. The Dutch submarines were useful. K-14, K-15, and O-19 were all pretty good subs. So Congo class. Henderson. Let's put it this way. The big thing, if Henderson hadn't died in 1939, that you would have had is you would have probably had 2 to 3 more aircraft carriers available in the fleet at this point. Yeah, honestly, I feel you wouldn't need big guns on the ships. I feel like a small river cable ship with armor and a few guns. Just keep it moving and shooting. Possibly, but you know. Anyway, so some questions. Well, here's the thing. If you have a Admiral of the Fleet, or equivalent to a 5-star officer down there as Supreme Commander Allied Forces, for Supreme Commander Commonwealth Forces in the Far East, I have a feeling that this poor gentleman gets put in under his command when in the Joint Command in Southeast Asia. At which point, General MacArthur will probably find that the biggest ego and toughest person known to mankind to take him on has just arrived, because Roger Keyes' ego is bigger than MacArthur's, and it's justifiably so. And in the nicest way, I have a feeling MacArthur might find himself being properly organised. Jebula, why was there no ABDA command set up ahead of time? It's not like British and the Dutch were not allies at war. Pretty much because, honestly, it was political inertia. It's political inertia. So, And where is HMS Exeter? Well, let's go back. You'll notice that in this formation, I have 3 proper-sized counties. But I'm also planning on leaving the Indian Ocean without a single light cruiser. Exeter is my compromise. She is not really, as far as I'm concerned, the best example of a county-class cruiser. She does very well at the Battle of the River Plate in a limited scenario, but she is pretty much a trade protection cruiser. So my plan is to leave her back in the Indian Ocean while I take all the light cruisers and all the destroyers. Okay, so she is my insurance policy. She is protecting my rear. It's a fun time. It's a fun time. Now, this is another nice graphic from Wikipedia I stole on the liners of Torres Vedras. And, it works. Aircraft. When enemy attacks, reconnaissance aircraft will gather as much information as possible and withdraw to Singapore. Bombers will seek to harry forces by night as much as possible, whether they're seaborne or landborne. The point is, the idea is that the forces have been trained since April to tell the Air Force where the bombers are, where the Japanese are, so that the bombs can land somewhere nearby. It doesn't matter if they hit, okay? One of the things that noticing out there in Singapore is they actually had a huge number of the 100-pound anti-submarine warfare bombs, which, as you know from my previous discussion of them, are absolutely freaking terrible. But they do have a contact detonation method, so you could go and drop a whole host of them all over the jungle. You have thousands of them literally sitting out there, so you could use those to terrorize the jungle. It doesn't matter. The point is you're making the Japanese life annoying. Yes, in the nicest way. In a battle of the egos, which MacArthur tends to get into with people, he would find he was facing the biggest ego known to mankind to fight him. What if the Rengo Katai deploys against your fleet? If the Japanese do bring all their battleships down, you have a problem. If they do bring all their battleships down. But the odds are, will they bring all their battleships down? You have aircraft, and with that force, as I said, back in the Indian Ocean, you can call them in. It's 8 days slow steaming. They're able to get there a lot quicker if they need to be. And if you've got aircraft, you can get there. You can get them there. And nicest way, okay, yes, they don't match up against the Japanese that well, but they do have radar-guided gunnery, so if they manage to get the fight in at night, then the Japanese will probably get bushwhacked. Because the Japanese don't have radar-controlled gunnery, other than the Congo, and Congo ain't going to be there till about June. Percival's problem is that he commands the army in war without ever leading a small unit action. Yeah, in nicest way, Percival has lots of problems. Yeah, and MacArthur would probably respect... he would respect Roger Keyes. So actually, they'd probably work together quite well, actually. Because probably, in nicest way, considering the generals that Keyes has got out there, other than Heath, he'd probably call want MacArthur over. Montgomery sent no. The army would never have sent Montgomery rather than Percival. Sadly enough. Yamamoto isn't ready till June. Nagato, Mutsu, so they could come down, but then honestly, the problem with the Japanese, they look big battleships, but in the nicest way, if they're taking on unless they've got their full squadron and full force, and if they get caught at night, the Royal Navy have radar control gunnery, the Japanese don't. The first hits will tell. He was considered too useful. Montgomery at this point was, I think, running lots of stuff in the UK. Anyway, so land forces. All the forward light forces withdraw to defensive line in an orderly manner, along with civilian population, destroying bridges, tunnels, railway lines, and mining roads as they go. Anything to hold up the Japanese attack. Delay it. Make it more difficult. Forces at the time will carry out Scorch. Forces at the line will carry out Scorch mission in front of it to remove all the cover for attacking enemies as far as possible. Ideally, I would like a mile to 2 mile long strip scorched earth. And before anyone says again, this wouldn't actually happen. Roger Keyes had actually come up with a similar plan for how to defend Norway. So we'll get there at one point. It's certainly something he would have done. He wanted to use old battleships to force Trondheim, and then he wanted to scorch earth several parts of Denmark to defend Norway. So in the nicest way, what Keyes would have probably done is, something quite tangible. And then what you have is the least experienced forces will get to man the lines. The least experienced forces will be sort of bedded in. The more experienced, the better forces will be held as the reserve forces. And the moment the least experienced, the lines are under attack, a reserve unit will be sent. And a reserve unit will be sent so they can coordinate. And all under the command of Heath directly, with Keyes standing back to support him, and Percival in charge of making sure the troops coming in are getting trained and properly going into to Heath. How deep is the sea? Yeah, that's the thing. If the whole point is that in the nicest way, if the Japanese bring their battleships around, they brought them into confined waters. So there's A, the land-based torpedo bombers. B, if they don't get till January, which they probably wouldn't have in a significant force, they could well be Royal Navy aircraft carriers there. There could be all sorts of submarines. It's just not a good place to bring your battleships if you're the Japanese. The British could justify bringing their battleships in there because using them would be boom. It would get through. And there's also land-based guns as well, which will also be aiming at battleships. When did the R-class get gunnery radar? Well, it's going to sound strange. They are upgraded for night fighting to an extent. Their radar is based on them being found by other people. But what would happen is you would have the ships with gunnery radar, which would be Prince of Wales, which would be Repulse, I think has it at this point, would use their in sort of like had already been done by the Royal Navy Mediterranean, would use their gunnery radar to aim illumination rounds to light up the enemy, and then boom, 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 basically, is what happens. So, that's the advantage. Naval Indian Ocean reinforcing Navy units will concentrate in Ceylon and only advance to Singapore once present in sufficient strength. They don't want them turning up in a penny packet. Again, this is straight out of Roger Keyes' playbook. You do not have your forces turning up in a penny packet. They either don't turn up or they turn up en masse. Remember, he'd been involved in Gallipoli. I like the idea of turning up in penny packet forces. You turned up in a proper force. You turned up strong, you turned up present, and you turned up there. You didn't turn up in a sort of small force to go, hello. You turn up in a force that goes, we're here. You going to do anything about it? And it's basically, as I said, it's buying time with buying time with territory. Gordon Bennett's 8th Australian Division are actually still pretty good at fighting, and they are still pretty good at doing their things. In the nicest way, yes, some of them had just learned how to use their rifle, but some of them were very experienced, and they proved themselves very good at taking on the Japanese at several points. So I would have put them as one of my more reliable units, and especially if they'd been based back in the defensive lines, which is where I had them as the response force, they've been great. And again, it doesn't matter what their artillery is. It doesn't matter all these things. If you're in defensive lines, you can have those artillery in fixed points, and you can have marked out where your targets are, and you can make your life a lot easier. Defensive war appears to be slightly easier in jungle, unlike Singapore. It is slightly easier if you can do it properly. If you haven't lost your officers, if you haven't been sacrificing your units and bleeding your units of their officers and NCOs all the way south because you kept trying to fight them in unprepared, the Japanese in unprepared positions with penny packet forces. Tis France's fault. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Jay Rection, no one would do that. In nicest way, and what I think actually they probably would have done when we start evacuating them to Australia. Honestly, that's probably what Keys would have started doing immediately. Evacuate the civilians, get rid of as many civilians as you can get rid of, like the British had done in Malta. A large number of civilians in Malta got moved to Alexandria at the beginning of World War II. Mostly, I think it was the naval ones, but they did certainly take some Maltese as well if they wanted to go, and that would be what would have happened in Singapore. As civilians, anyone that could be got out of the way would be got out of the way. Right, likely results. So the Japanese had almost run out of supplies by the time the British surrendered. If you'd held out for a few more days, they probably would have run out of supplies. They were at the end of the logistics line. They have a few but very limited tanks. They have their aircraft are far further away, and in fact, if you've done enough damage to the Malayan airfields, those aircraft are a long way away. If you have the defensive lines around Singapore, you pretty much hold that area most likely. And if the Japanese fleet does come, you respond with whatever you have available at Ceylon and you get it there as quickly as possible. If the Japanese don't come, then at your own leisure, you bring that fleet from Ceylon to Singapore. And you basically make the big entrance as it comes in. They might not actually be able to operate from Singapore. It might be like Malta, where it's used more as a staging post for small forces. But the whole point is, if they turn up, they're there. It's the thing. Also, the odds are Singapore would quickly become, especially if it was held for long enough, a base for, it would be held for submarines and those things, which would start really harrying the Japanese. Imagine if you could do the big submarine campaign that the Americans did, but instead of basing your forces from Australia, you're basing your submarines from Singapore. You can't evacuate Singapore completely, probably not, but you can start to evacuate a certain number of people, and it has a big impact if you can evacuate some. There is very messy logistics, as Jeff Beeler is also pointing out, but in a nicest way, what you do is you keep. That's another reason you have the defensive positions. The thing is, if you've had the built defensive positions, then the logistics is solved because you've built in the infrastructure into defenses, i.e. roads and other things, so you can keep the supplies. You have stores put along those defensive lines. You can have all these things built in. Basically, you can solve pretty much every problem you have in the Battle of Malaya by having some blooming prepared defensive lines. You can solve it all, pretty much. And it sounds like it's a panacea. Yeah, again, the Japanese could still win. There is always a chance that someone could be a complete and utter idiot. But considering the forces the Japanese has and the limitations they have on their own logistics and own supplies, one of the reasons they managed to beat the British so easily and beat the Commonwealth forces so easily, relatively, is because these forces are fighting as penny packets, because they are broken up, because they have no logistics, because they have all these issues. And you can solve all that by having had a plan, withdraw them down, and having defensive lines built up with logistics, with things. So your minimal logistics forces can be maximized. Your minimal motorized vehicles can be maximized by having them in an area where it works. The Kido Butai is not going to show up most quickly. I'm sorry, James Young. It just isn't. There's always this idea that the Japanese carriers can show up. They can't. They've just done Pearl Harbor in the 7th of December. When they finally get back to Japan, they then need to restock. They then have to deal with what the Americans are doing, what the carriers are doing. It's the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the nicest way, the Army's not going to ask for help from the Imperial Japanese Navy until they have to. In which case, you're talking probably January time when they actually get round to asking them, especially if they're winning. If the British Commonwealth forces are retreating down to the lines in front of the Japanese Army is going to think they're winning. So they're not going to call up for the Japanese Navy to come help them. They're still winning. So in a nice way, the Japanese Army is not going to call for the Japanese Navy till probably if they're probably January, maybe even February. By which point you have a nice large force at Ceylon coming through. Yes, the Japanese will probably be stronger than that force, but they will have to then be dealing with that force there, the American force, wherever the American forces are, and all this scenario going on. You might well have the Americans go, well, hang on, we've got a couple of carriers, the British have got a couple of carriers, let's link them up. There are all sorts of options which can come in at that point. This is why I end at February, because it starts to get really, really beyond your beyond it goes completely from being sort of plausible, counterfactual, nice way to think about history, to think about how else these things can work, what's the reality of the situation, to being complete and utter, I'm just going to develop a giant flying balloon which has bristling machine guns sort of scenario. Okay. James Young, yes, one division is diverted wake, but 4 divisions is still 4 carriers is still a handful for any fleet coming from Ceylon. True, but to get close enough, there's also have to get in range of the land-based aircraft. B, there are also the land-based guns, which are anti-ship guns, and all the other facilities there. In most way, for the Kido Butai, if they come in, as I said, it's going to be in February, probably March, in which time there could well be Allied forces lined up, and you could be dealing with quite a major fleet under the command of Tom Phillips. Yes, he's a fairly good. If it's still under the command of Tom Phillips, there's always a potential that Somerville gets sent out as the senior commander. In which case, as he does anyway, eventually to replace when Phillips is killed. So you could well end up with some very senior officers out there commanding, and you could also again. There's one thing sending out forces when you lose Singapore. There's another thing sending out forces when you've managed to fighting to retain Singapore. When you're fighting to retain Singapore, then the urge to send the forces out is that much quicker. You've got to send out just that much more. So the forces that become available would potentially be that much more. Thomas Roy, I doubt the civilian population would have wanted to be exactly evacuated. I doubt it sort of too, but I think some of them might have been. Kevin Tag, plus you put your stockpiles closer to that final defensive line. Yes, in Singapore. You have all the stockpiles and you have them stuff coming out from there, basically. Just don't worry. Gunnery Japan. Very little 16 hits and 18s, except for 1 or 2 hits on CVs and some 18 not used. Yeah, I don't think the Japanese battleships are that great at gunnery this time. They're definitely not the force which fought the Russians at Tsushima. Trent Talaga, some 9/10 of the RAF radar people in Malaysia were lost with the fall of Singapore. Their loss helped create Japanese radar in 1943-44. Yeah, so nice as way. If they'd managed to be kept, it could have been quite different. JP, I was watching a doc last night, and the Aussies could see Japanese troops using the Sultan of Johore's palace, but were not allowed to attack it because it would upset the Sultan. Yes, that did literally happen. And again, I point you to Supreme Commander Roger Keyes. We can all imagine what Roger Keyes, who wanted to do all sorts of things in his time, would have responded to that one. Or even Montgomery, or any of these personalities. The trouble is you don't have this sort of person out there in command. Tom Trump, would there have been sufficient materials for any large-scale defensive lines at a time, or local labour? Yes, there would have been. There are the sufficient materials. There is local labour. Concrete is very easy to mix, and you can use bamboo instead of steel. There's all sorts of things you can do. Ivan Simpson, the chief engineer who was actually captured by the Japanese and wasn't allowed to build the lines, had extensive plans for how to draw the lines and was an absolutely exceptional engineer and had an entire brigade of Royal Engineers sitting in Singapore. So he had an entire engineering brigade. Plus, there are engineers attached to various attachments, attached to various of the divisions and the corps structure. So in the nicest way, there are plenty of engineers out there to run it, and there's plenty of local labour you can hire. Golden Eagle, have you looked into why the IJN and IJA hate each other so much? I'm not sure. I just think it's because there's an A in the day of the week. James Young, I was assuming this takes a few weeks, time to refit. Concur on IJ and IJN split, but I'm assuming this happens in late January. If it's late January, the British have a significant fleet, and again, it's still, the thing is, it could be a battle, but again, the Japanese are going to be having to deal with what's there and what they're dealing with. There's going to be land-based aircraft, land-based artillery, if you get within range. If you don't get within range, let's go through these quickly. So this one. So in a nice way, as you can see, Singapore is down right in the middle there. If the Keto Batai are going to come into this area, A, they're going to be coming into submarine ranges because the submarines are going to be operating there. And yes, theoretically, I have to bring my battleships and everything from Sri Lanka down straight through the Straits of Malacca. I could also bring them round and up from the south if I wanted outside of Java. Pardon me. And I could do all sorts of things with them if I wanted to. But the thing is, if they're coming down, you have to deal with the fact that they will be coming in. Where is the Keto Batai going to be striking from? What's it going to be working here? And in which area is it going to be? And these things become slightly more predictable if they're heading towards Singapore. The real point is, if I can expand it out and disappear for a second. The Rio Islands become a sort of trap space for you with your submarines, especially the closer you get to Singapore. So if I'd been the Japanese, I'd have probably wanted to keep the Keto Batai as far away from that area as I possibly could. And as in the nicest way, as Carl Gazman points out, the IJN might want the IJA to bleed dry with glee. They might want to as well. They do. An idea for Ground Forces Commander Percy Hobart. He was in the wilderness at this point. If you could combine him with Keyes, may God. Oh, good Lord, yes, Percy Hobart would have gone. I do agree he was, but it's. I didn't want to make too many changes, and I was literally thinking, okay, one officer. And at certain, I had to look around at certain ranks. So they had to be 4-star or above. They had to be able to command the confidence of both Churchill and Curtin. They had to be a strong enough personality. They were going to have an impact. And they had to be someone who would be acceptable to the Army and the Navy and the Air Force. Believe it or not, that strips down officers quite a lot once you're using those criteria at this point. And you basically end up with 2. Twit and the Keyes. Twit's too old, so that's Keyes left. Jeff Beeler, yes, he has. Churchill has so many ideas about the Prince of Wales and Tirpitz and all these things. James Young, are you assuming that Kimmel doesn't get relieved, or is there still the post-Pearl chaos? More than likely the post-Pearl chaos. Jack, so we are talking about a situation where Japanese probably hold Rabaul, maybe laying Gilbert's, Philippines and Norvell. Java will be another critical point. I think, in a nice way, if you control Singapore, the odds of the Japanese actually successfully controlling Rabaul is... I'm going to disappear again. It becomes unlikely. I think also maybe it's going to sound strange, but Sumatra and that sort of the Philippines probably do get lost, but I have a feeling the Americans end up holding onto it because there are a lot of issues. If you're the Japanese, if Singapore is held, then if we attack Burma, the armies in Singapore can advance up the Malaysian peninsula, especially if they're reinforced. If Sumatra is held and Java is held, then those become critical areas which really do block in the Japanese. And let's put it this way, it turns Southeast Asia into as much of a quagmire as it could have been, but it just makes it slightly more winnable for the Allies and slightly more of a stalemate for the Japanese and stops them getting into the Indian Ocean. And the thing is, if you have them not getting in the Indian Ocean and not able to concentrate as much on Burma, then you don't have a scenario where the Japanese are basically in control of the Andaman Sea and parts of the Bay of Bengal, and you manage to keep those supply lines running, so you hopefully don't have the famine in India. And that's sort of the thing. If you can avoid the famine in India, that's a big advantage. We'll see 99. British should see Ceylon as their Pearl Harbor and Malaya, Singapore as their Philippines forward operating base. Pretty much that's what I've decided it defined as. Terence Moment. Bombing of Darwin was 19th February 1942. Singapore still strong means it replaces Darwin on that date. Yeah. So basically, this is the point. I'm thinking that the Japanese, if they do show up, it's February. In which case... Disposable. Local labour and soldiers would be able to make some decent headway in defence structures, not likely concrete buildings. So routes would be an issue for trenches, but it's better than nothing. No, they can make concrete. They had huge supplies of the right facilities in Singapore and Malaysia. In fact, the Japanese, half their defences they built on some of the islands came from the supplies which they apparently captured in Singapore. I'm not quite sure about the truth of that statement, but I read it in a book and went, huh? Because apparently Ivan Simpson had been sent to. The whole reason he'd been actually sent and put in charge as a brigadier in Singapore was to start building defences. And he'd been sent out there and all sorts of supplies had been sent out for him and then wasn't allowed to because no one would overrule local governors. And some of the army officers had this strange idea that if you build defences, it would demoralise the troops. Australian division pulled out of North Africa. Does that go to Australia or Singapore? Probably to Singapore in that case, because let's be honest, if you can hold Singapore, you can stop the Japanese getting to Australia as easily, because Singapore is the major facility. You know, in the nicest way, all the Philippines, all these things, they don't have the infrastructure to support a major fleet. This is the big trouble for the Japanese in getting into the Indian Ocean. Singapore is the fleet, is the base they can launch from. Banham, how would Singapore defence have affected the North African campaign in Mediterranean? It might have delayed Torch by a couple of months. It would probably not have affected much of the others. But it might have actually had an interesting effect in terms of the Mediterranean, in terms of how supplies get organised. But honestly, considering the forces which get deployed out to the Eastern Fleet anyway in 1942, it's not going to have that much a bigger impact because those are some of the forces, instead of them going to the Eastern, being based in the Indian Ocean off Sri Lanka, they're going to be sent to Ceylon and be there to support Singapore and go to Singapore. In Car, British forces civilians seem to have expected to politely surrender. With full knowledge of how they would be treated, attitude could have been different. They didn't expect us as politely surrender. They didn't think they would. They seem to think that they are invincible and that they would win and the Japanese wouldn't really attack. There was this idea that the Japanese wouldn't really attack. And as we can see from this, the Japanese do attack. They really do. James Young. Also, how much does the RN know about Long Lance? I've seen conflicting reports. At least the RN can fight at night in 1941, unlike the USM. Yes, there's an advantage. The RN seem to have some knowledge of Long Lance, but how widespread their knowledge is up to question. I think Phillips, as a destroyer man, is probably more up to date on it than most. So actually, he could have been a very interesting officer if he hadn't been had. And remember, he gets deployed Force. Z sounds like Force Zod to me, so that's why I'm going Force Z. He gets deployed and he's got Penny Packet Force and he's got to do something because it's rather like Crete and Namsos. It's all these scenarios and Dunkirk. The army is suffering. The Air Force is bleeding. The Navy has to go and fight to try and protect them. He goes with what he has available and it just isn't enough. And it just isn't right. Jeff Beeler, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Singapore could have sent all civilian independence away, but no one felt threatened until it was too late. That is the trouble. They should have done, but they didn't. This is Francis Paul. At the clock, what's your take on following a successful defense? Would you counterattack or would hold position and not push your luck? Personally, I would not leave positions. Too risky. I would build up forces and then I would counterattack with the forces I'd built up. I wouldn't counterattack with the forces immediately available. I would let the forces which had won the defense rest for a bit. And then I would counterattack. I would push through. First attack would be new forces which had come in. And then the attack which came rolling after that would be the forces which had come from defensive lines. So they'd always have, and I'd keep the defensive lines up to date. Jarrett, Coral Sea may be replaced with battles on Java, Flores, Banda Seas, then Malay Archipelago would replace Solomon's as a traditional battlefield, more than likely. Jeff Beeler, Force Z is on level sending the Canadian Brigade to Hong Kong. It is, and honestly, again, one of the interesting things is if you put Roger Keyes in charge of the defense, he would have been in charge of all the forces going to Hong Kong, all the forces going, all the sort of to Shanghai and the various places they're being put around. And I have a feeling Keyes again would have been A, put them on a far more war footing, and B, would honestly, I'm wondering if he would have sent forces to Hong Kong. Because as a senior admiral in the Royal Navy, as early in the 1930s, he basically said that Hong Kong, at the beginning of any war with Japan, was to be abandoned, all forces withdrawn, until enough fleet could be sent up there. And it wasn't a popular position, but he certainly had taken it. And I wonder if those forces sent to Hong Kong might have found themselves reassigned to Singapore and Malaya. So you might have had even more troops down there to play with. Kevin Taggart. However, because they didn't finish the war with the US, then the Japanese faced a horrible situation of dealing with the US and the British and Oceania. Yeah, pretty much. Albert Sawaki, wouldn't FAA be outclassed by Japanese Navy Air Force in a carrier battle? No. Japanese are still well-trained crews and decent aircraft at the start of the war. Yeah, but the Royal Navy aircraft you're fighting in 1941 are different than the Royal Navy aircraft of 1939. The Japanese don't have as many Zeros as we like to talk about at this point. So the Japanese carrier aircraft are not as anything far from it. And the Royal Navy aircraft which turned up would have been carrying Sea Hurricanes and Hellcats. So, no, Sea Hurricanes and Wildcats, I think. So in the nicest way, I think they would have been more than suitable and up to the task. Probably some full Mars, a whole load of Albacores, and the Albacores actually proved pretty good. There were 5 of them flying anywhere down there from the land, and they proved fairly effective against Japanese forces. So yeah, I'll give them a chance, especially at night, especially if they manage to catch the Japanese at night, which they might be. Because remember, they've got Catalinas, they've got all sorts of flying boats going around here. If you have enough information, if you spot the Japanese fleet coming in, which you might well do if you've got Singapore intact, you can attack them at night. Kevin, also, what was the logistics of rearming their fleet and aircraft carriers? They have stuff out there. The British do have some resupply units sitting based in Ceylon, actually. There's a dispute over where they are, and there's also some which are based in Aden, which have to get called in. Nobody seems to notice, but it's actually samurai clan rivalries. Army also calls were created from the samurai of the Morai clan. Navy likewise from the Samusa clan. Might be, but honestly, there's a fair number of clans which are involved. But yeah, could be. Vision question. Sorry, I came in late. Any plans for St. George and Penang Island as defensive strongpoint with RAF, RN, MTD bases behind Japanese lines? Honestly, no. I prefer not to do that. There isn't really enough forces to spread out to defend that. That's the trouble. I would love to do all these sort of creative things, but I honestly think, again, if I'd been Roger Keyes in this scenario, and I'm pretty creative in that scenario, but the thing is, I'm also very much a realist of the forces I have available, and I've only been training them since April. Admittedly, since April, I could have probably turned half of them into commandos, knowing my previous experience, but, I would have tried, certainly. Eamon, from reading Kaigan, so far it seems they hate each other because of money, prestige, and that each branch thought they should be in charge. Yeah, that's pretty much more likely. The samurai one is a nice idea, but I think it's more likely both thought they should be in charge. Seeing what geography, U.S. force at Bataan had Central Mountain to anchor its defensive line to its flanks. Help that Plan Orange was there to direct this operation. I can't see British contingency plans. The British had several contingency plans for the Far East. But basically, they were hold on until the fleet arrived. And the thing is, the Army and the Air Force were supposed to be able to hold on until the fleet arrived. The fleet that was sent wasn't enough, and they weren't positioned to arrive. This is another reason why I've taken that plan, which is quite good, and I've moved the plan to the fleet being in the Far East, but being at Ceylon, so that much farther back from the Japanese, so they can't launch a pre-attack, basically. Old Richard, iChain must react strongly to any delay, given the whole strategic point of starting the war. No oil fields, no victory. Not necessarily. It's basically they might do, but they've got other things they've got to deal with. Okay, so it'll be an issue. And again, anything that holds it up is going to cause them, because Japanese are burning through all supplies far faster than they are getting them in at this point. So actually, the longer it takes to Singapore, even if Singapore does eventually fall, causes the Japanese a lot of trouble. But I don't think under this plan that Singapore would fall. You still need to tell us about Phillips. I will get there. So And so I reckon, in nicest way, James Young, as an old Richard, I do concur, but I think it's February by the time they come down. And I think there is a reason, because honestly, getting them down earlier than February is going to be difficult. Jeff Beeler, diplomatically, you have to try and hold all of Malaya, even if the Malaysians won't let you dig in. No, you don't. You do with the governor and the people you're dealing with in the current Malayan command structure. If you have someone down there who's prepared to do what's necessary, you don't. You can very much say, you are holding Malaya. You do have a division holding the border. That's lovely. You just have fallback positions created. Jay Chung, I'm not sure the Americans can hold Philippines, but that's a long story centering on MacArthur's Max defense plan. Yeah, I don't think so. Dr. Clark, wait. How can the armies from Malay move to Burma when Thailand is in the way? Thailand sided with Japan, remember? Thailand didn't really side with Japan. They got taken over by Japan. Okay? More than anything. And you would move from Malaya up to Burma by fighting through Thailand. That's what you'd have to do. And in the nicest way, that's the thing. If you've got the Japan are... Okay. In a nicer way, if you're sitting there and if you think, if Japan's fighter is invading Burma and you've got forces moving up through the Malay Peninsula to, you've got the Japanese army, then got to decide, do we launch an offensive against India, which is going to be launching against a force which has a lot of troops, or are we going to try and deal with this attack coming up? And if we do that, then we've got a guy called Slim behind us who's going to launch an attack. So either way, you have a lot of problems if you're Japan. It's basically, exactly. Use narrow water minefields and hedgehog defense to defensible areas and no oil to the Japanese Navy in time. That's pretty much the point. The Bay of Bengal is your line of Torres Vedras in this situation. Some night albacore strikes on Palmang would get the Japanese attention. Yeah. There's all sorts of fun things you can do at this point if you're, if you're defending South. If you manage to retain Singapore, you can do a lot of defenses. Rabid Razorback. Where was Abda in all this? It wasn't really formed till after the fall of Singapore. That's the thing. It doesn't really get started, Abda, until after the fall of Singapore properly. Jerison, demoralizing troops. You know what demoralizing being assaulted without any defenses. It does. It does really demoralize the troops. Especially when they're not well trained, and in nicest way, you haven't been able to train them properly because the governor doesn't like you training them properly because they're worried it's going to upset the Japanese. In which case, again, Roger Keyes. You have to have someone out there who's senior enough and experienced enough that they can tell the people who are causing trouble to bugger off, basically. Jeff Beeler, Percival the idiot will not let defences be built. Being tonight. Because he built some machine gun bunkers before the war. Not sure what changes his mind. Because he is trying to be nice to everyone and is trying to do consensual leadership. But unlike Percy Noble, he can't do consents in the way that gets people to do what he wants them to do. Jay Richardson, wasn't there an Australian defence strategy where Singapore Malaya would become an Australian mandate like New Guinea? Yes, there was. There were all sorts of plans. Carl Gasberg, and they really underestimate Japanese technology. Yes, they do. But at this point, again, you're not dealing with the top end of Japanese technology really being deployed down here. The 25th Army really isn't that amazing in its formations. It's just experienced and it's a coherent force and it's able to be used as a chunk, as a formation, rather than as penny packets. If Singapore holds, how would that affect the attack on New Guinea? It would probably make the attack on New Guinea a lot more complicated. In the nicest way, I see it becoming a massive issue for them. New Guinea isn't the sort of place, if you've got Singapore, and especially if you've got a big enough fleet sitting in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka, Ceylon, able to come across to Singapore when it wants to, and from there it can come to New Guinea, you could well have a scenario where the Japanese get caught in an American-British sandwich. Nick Walters, that's not the only time I've heard of lack of prep and underestimating Japanese. Even with the little I know, it makes me angry 80-odd years later. It does. It seems... And the thing is, the reason there's lack of prep is all these officers know, but they're all used to being staff officers, most of them. And you've got... In a way, you've got Heath, who does know and is trying his best, but he's fighting against the tide. You have Percival has all these ideas, but has no way of implementing them because he won't overrule anyone. You have Gordon Bennett, who is just Gordon Bennett. You have Thor Phillips, and I'll get onto it now. Okay. Phillips comes into this mess. He is a career destroyer officer who does believe that the battleship is still very useful, isn't so sure after watching some exercises in the early 1930s how powerful and how strong carrier aircraft are, and still thinks battleships have a chance. But most importantly, he's very much a can-do attitude Royal Navy officer. He therefore is going to... he is positioned in Singapore with a handful of destroyers and a couple of battleships. In other words, he has zilch. He has nothing. He has basically worse than nothing because he has such a small, pathetic force. It just makes him look weak, makes Britain look weak. And the trouble is, the moment Malaya is invaded, he either advances and and tries to look strong and tries to do something, or admits that he is weak and withdraws. And he's a destroyer officer. He's not only a destroyer officer, but he's one of the shortest officers who ever served in the Royal Navy, I swear, looking at his rank. He's nicknamed Tom Thumb. He is that short. And despite him being a lovely guy, his trick is, I'm going to try radio silence to get close to the Japanese, which means he doesn't call for air support when he needs it. And also the blooming air defenses spread out all over the place have all been over. They are completely overwhelmed. And it's just... It is a cluster. FCUK. It is absolutely atrocious what goes on, and frankly, it should never be allowed to happen to an officer. If he'd again been under the command of, there had been a senior officer in command, a supreme commander, able to go, no, you will sit in Ceylon and wait till I call you, i.e. like Keyes would have probably done, because that was Keyes' style. because Keyless is just as aggressive as Phillips, but he's had the experience of war and the experience of lots of other things to make him slightly more calculating in his time and slightly more controlled. You would have had a far different scenario, because that aggression, that power could have been very useful if coupled with enough battleships, enough aircraft carriers. He would have charged in and taken on the Kido Butai. He might not have had much of a chance, but he would have done it. He'd have certainly tried to attack him at night, again, like Somerville later tried to do. Somerville just decided after he'd done one attack he'd done enough and was going to withdraw. But Phillips would have gone boom for it, and he might have been successful. And the Kido Butai might have ended up falling in the South China Sea or somewhere, or, the Philippines Bay, maybe, while fighting the Royal Navy. Less from the Civil War, Bitron. What demoralizes troops is losing and running. Holding defensive positions and having a high morale was common in both Union and Confederate armies. It was good. Yeah. Thomas Ryder. Hong Kong pretty much indefensible long term once Japanese control Canton and Formosa. Yeah, that's the trouble. Sean Brown, I think you may not be taking Japanese air superiority fully into account. Concentration of Allied aircraft into fewer airfields just gives juicier targets, even with air superiority becomes Norway. In the nicest way, Singapore has 4 airfields. You have 5 more in northern Malaya, and you have 4 down in Singapore. That is not concentrating your aircraft. You still only have 14 squadrons, so you have 3 squadrons per airfield, maybe 4. That's not really concentrating your aircraft. And you can build some hardened defenses if you want, and all sorts of things to look after them. Nice way, you can do this properly if you have them properly organized. Sorry. Andy Folds, Wildcats equal Martel at Mark 1. Yes, but the only ones who really call them that are the Brits. So I tend to keep to Wildcats because it's just easier, because the Brits understand that and everyone else understands it. Jeff Beeler. Atrus Indomitable with fighter direction would chew up any unescorted land plane attacks which all the Japanese have in the area until the Kido Butai eventually show up. Yeah, pretty much. That is the thing. And you have fighter direction available on radar units on Singapore. So, in the nicest way, if you'd had those fighters concentrated in Singapore, where they could be fighter controlled, they would be able to chew up air attacks. They wouldn't stop them completely, but they would start causing trouble, especially as those aircraft would be launching from the maximum of their range down to Singapore. The problem is with Singapore in terms of air defense is by the time you get to fighting in Singapore, you've lost so many aircraft, so many stores fighting in the north, and as you way down, you can't run a proper air defense. So, in the nicest way, concentration does save the nation. Would Port Blair factor into my plans? Probably a bit, but not much. I would, in nicest way, Roger Keyes would have been making decisions on the plans, but the case is, it's all about defending this by this. It's about creating defense in depth that you can support. Jeff Beeler, part of Philippines' problem seems to be lack of useful intelligence. Too many nervous Nellies jumping in shadows. Malaya should have been as well organized as the UK by now, but garrison mentality. Yes, that's pretty much half the trouble. And that's, again, why you have Roger Keyes taking command in April 1941. He then has 7 months. Where would you station Roger Keyes himself? On the flagship or in Singapore? Singapore, in the nicest way, in Singapore. And who takes charge of the fleet in Singapore? You would have Phillips in charge of the fleet at sea. In the nicest way. As Supreme Commander, he doesn't get to go to sea. As often. Probably. It's Roger Keyes. Okay? In the nicest way. If Warspite shows up and then under some sort of eventuality, he probably does end up going to sea because he'd go, that's my flagship, and all the rest of you can bugger off. But leaving that and eventually decide, he'd probably let Phillips run it quite happily. Thomas Frotler, Japanese IJN air fleets, about 60% of the fighters were zeros by end of 1941. Yes, but fleets, and this is the thing: is those are the IJN air fleets, and that's 60%, and most of those aren't really in this area at this point. You would probably see those not turning up really till 1942 in this area. James Young, this was great, but I gotta go. I gotta run. Break's over. Take care, James. Schumack. Also, Japan can't replace pilots because of their very particular training system. Yeah, that is a trouble. Jeff Beeler, long fighting in Malaya delays the attack at Rabaul. It delays a lot of things fighting in Japan, fighting in Malaya. Golden Eagle, Aboriginal. Hey, what do you think the reason behind the no one being in charge bit festers from? Yeah, I see. Golden Eagle, Aboriginal, Golden Eagle. By 1930s, the original high-ranking officers from the clans had founded the Japanese army and had died or retired. Rivalry due to Japanese Meiji Constitution. I've been looking into this a bit, and eventually, when I produce the next versions of the Japanese, Anglo-Japanese relations, it's going to be interesting. The reason I've been delayed producing that is I've wanted to get this working properly to an extent that I can do it properly. It's going to be a big thing when I do it and all. Constant drowsiness. Having been through Malaysia, it is shocking that any army was able to go through the entire Malaysian peninsula so quickly. Pretty much it's only because, well, you know, even then it does take them, broadly speaking, 10 weeks to go from landing to victory. The thing is, it's because it's ineffective resistance. It's just penny packets. Michael Trout, how does Keys impact Adler Command? Well, suddenly all those those forces probably end up under Phillips, his sea commander at sea. In the nicest way, Phillips would be the senior at sea admiral, and those Abab would probably end up with him, and it would be combined into a Commonwealth allied Southeast Asian fleet, probably called the Far East Fleet. Remember, Keys is not the naval commander out there. Keys is the supreme Commonwealth commander and Allied forces Far East. So he's in charge of everyone and everything, which is why he'd probably be based in Singapore, especially if he sent out in April 1941. Phillips made a strange in-cut. Well, the reason Phillips doesn't request it is he's trying not to give away his position by doing radio broadcasts because he's worried that'll tell the Japanese where he is. So that's why they don't do it till too late. Jeff Wheeler, who does Phillips report to historically? Anyone? No one. That's the thing. Phillips out there it's an entirely separate chain of command. And then you have the fact that the person in charge of the Army and Air Force technically isn't just in charge of coordinating, really, rather than commanding. This is why you need someone out there. Ian Carr, did Singapore have radar? Yes, it did. Jeff Beeler, for some reason, most of the Buffaloes were at Singapore, leaving the northern base on they weren't actually. The Buffaloes were spread around. I've got one list here of them. Right, so you have got Bristol Blenheims at RAF Tenga. You have 16 Buffaloes based at RAF Savang. You have RAF Kalig, and again, this is Singapore. You have them at another 30 Buffaloes. Then you have in northern Malaya, you have Sungai Pentai, 12 Buffaloes and 12 Blenheims. At Katabaru, you have 12 Lockheed Hudsons and 2 Brewster Buffaloes. 2, okay? 2. And then at RAF Kuntan, you have 8 Bristol Blenheim, and Allo Star, you have 11 Bristol Blenheim. So basically, the idea is you concentrate all the Blenheims and all the Buffaloes back in Singapore. You actually have a decent sort of formation down there to do some air defense. Phillips would command it, and he'd still probably be in Prince of Wales. That's who'd be commanding the fleet, but he'd have as overall commander. He would have Golden Eagle. He would have as a supreme commander above him. There would be Keys. Jeff Biller, by North Atlantic standards, Force Z is a major force, but by Pacific standards, it's a sitting duck. Yes. Well, the trouble is, it's basically Force Z is a force which is a surface radar, anti-surface radar force in its structure. And the trouble is, it's modeled in part on the successful Force H. But in the nicest way, Force H works because there's also the home fleet, the Mediterranean fleet, and all the other things around it. So they aren't on their own. This is going to be completely unsupported on its own. Daniel Phillips, you'll probably have to take 60% of the 90% by the end of January. They are that bad, but this is probably the only viable plan now the Hurricanes... Yeah, take care at dinner time, but yes. In a few months, one could turn the area to... Yeah, that's basically the plan. Airman, if the British keep Singapore, then this affects the ability to move supplies from the Dutch East Indies to home lines, correct? This could drastically shorten the war in the Pacific. It could drastically shorten the war. If you think about it, if you keep Singapore, that is your forward submarine base for the South China Sea. Yeah, the Japanese aren't going to be enjoying that one. All right, then. Bam, 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 bam. Bam, bam. If we go back to this one. This is the point. If you keep Singapore, your submarine bases go from, Australia to Singapore. Ooh, that's a nice big circle. And you'd probably get a lot more British submarines showing up as well. So, Phillips Thompson would still be fleet commander and Peterborough was his flagship. Yes, Golden Eagle. Yes, you would. I think often is knowing you have a good second line to pull back to is reassuring. If you know you have somewhere to withdraw to, you may well be more comfortable fighting in the first line. That's the point of my defensive structure. And you've got 3 lines. You've got the first line, the second line, and then you've got Singapore as your redoubt. So you've got a whole lot of space to pull back into. Nick Waters, how big a difference did the use of lots of bicycles I hear about make? Also, some tanks, not very good, but some poor tanks better than none. Yeah, that's the thing. And bicycle divisions help with mobility. That's the thing. Thomas Wright, a bit silly not using radio when you know your ships have been spotted by enemy planes. Yeah. The trouble is, he also doesn't think he has anything to call upon. He's had conversations with the very lovely... what's his name? With this particular gentleman. I keep forgetting the name of Brooke Popham, who basically told him there's nothing to call. So he not only was trying to keep quiet because he didn't think, he didn't want to agree with his position. He also didn't think there was anything to call. Amen. The IJA wasn't the most modern force in 2RC. It's primarily a light infantry force using pre-1940 doctrine. Good against the Chinese and poorly led equipped Allied forces, but not much else, I think. In 1940, 25th Army, possibly. Could call that, definitely. Right, I'll be back in a second. Someone just called me. But I think I've caught up with the questions. Okay. Oh, good lord, we have something. Yes, we're going to. Good one. Madras or Colombo? Probably Colombo. It's definitely initially. Madras probably later. Jeff Beeler, funny how everyone talks about the lack of Allied tanks but ignores the large numbers of Allied anti-tank guns. Yes, the thing is, the British did have a lot of anti-tank guns out there, so they could have used them. If they'd had a defensive line in the nicest way, the Japanese tanks would have not been had much success. But the trouble is, they keep trying to defend undefensible positions, which haven't been prepared, which haven't had anything done to them, and it's just, oh, goodness me. Tis transport. Do you think an evacuation should have been considered too? I'm not sure they have spare chances, but it could have been saved a significant number of men if needed, even if vulnerable to attack. The trouble is, they had no preparation, no organisation, and it fell. And again, there is no navy out there to do an evacuation. You have a staff officers in charge, and they are very good at writing plans, but they're not good at making decisions. And the nicest way, the officers who are good at making decisions are not being used properly. So, Jeff Beeler, Malaya does not seem to have had any kind of aerial organization. No central command of units. Truth? No, it did. It had an air command structure. That's one of the good things Popham had done. He had got a good command structure in place. He managed to spread it up. You have fighters which can only really... Okay, let's take the lessons of the Battle of Britain, which I always love for its mantra. In the nicest way, you have radar-controlled fighters. If you take the case of the war in the Mediterranean, it's radar-controlled fighters. The radar is all down in Singapore. The radar really isn't spread about the rest of the Malaya. So in the nicest way, why are you bothering having the fighters in the rest of the Malaya? There's no point, nothing they can do. They have no fighters to direct them. They have nothing there to help them. They are just two fighters in one case. Two fighters! Two! Sitting in a air base. What's the bleeding point? And the rest are Bristol Blenheims. Why? Ay, caramba. Bandholm, if a number of sloops or coastal destroyers have been built in India or Singapore, would the crews have been Indian servicemen or RN crews? Probably Indian. And there were several built in India. And that would have been an interesting thing. Definitely if you'd had certain officers in charge for longer in the... let's put it this way. If you'd had someone like Henderson or even Keyes himself in charge since 1939, it'd been amazing how many things could have appeared indigenously and locally. Jeff Beeler, the GDW War Game 1942 does not give the British any divisions other than Australians to show the lack of good organisation. They do have divisions. The Indians do have a nice divisions, and there are British divisions. But they lose officers. So many officers get lost. One of the interesting things I was rather interested in was when I was going through so many of these things and looking through these different units and their structures, and you have the Indian 9th Infantry Division. Major General Arthur Edward Barstow is killed on the 28th of January at Layang. You can go down the various officers. You have so many of the colonels killed, so many of the different units killed. You have Major General David Lyon, then appears to disappear from the 11th Infantry Division. Different people take over. So the 11th Infantry Division goes through about 3 commanders. The 28th Gurkha Infantry Brigade, they lose... one lieutenant colonel at Slim River, another one dies in Indian Ocean. They're decorated, but they're the 2nd Battalion 1st Gurkha Rifles is the 28th Infantry Brigade. 2nd Battalion of the 1st Gurkha Rifles. 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Gurkha Rifles. 2nd Battalion of the 9th Gurkha Rifles. This is my point when I'm talking about the 28th Brigade and people go, oh, they were only recently formed and they don't really know what they're doing. It's the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Gurkha Rifles. They're not really a recently formed battalion. The first Gurkha Rifles have been formed in 1815, roughly. And let's go through. You lose a lot of officers at Slim River, a lot of senior. Basically, if you want to die young, you go be a colonel or above in Malaya. They lose a lot of commanding officers. And this is the trouble. You're fighting disorganized defenses. You lose a lot of senior officers very quickly. And you lose a lot of senior NCOs. You lose a lot of your officers very quickly. And this is what happens. Brooke Popham did believe the Blenheim could still be used as a fighter. That guy, Air Chief Marshal Robert Brooke Popham, against what he considered were probably less than capable Japanese aircraft. Might that explain his deployment of them? It might, but honestly, still, no. If they've got no radar, there's no point using them there. Martin Already, would it not make sense to withdraw the Hudsons to Singapore rather than the Blenheim, as the Hudsons would be was the better bomber? I actually, if you notice when I've read the thing, my thing is I've withdrawn all their supplies and all their things down to Singapore, but the Hudsons I have wandering around doing the reconnaissance role because I think they're better at that than the Blenheim as well. And I also think, in the nicest way, I am concentrating forces, and the Hudsons are less able to be used as fighters. And they can be more easily withdrawn, so you probably keep them quite back. You wouldn't need to have as many of them forward. Could amassing the fleet by removing the convoy duty leave the convoys vulnerable to attacking in the ocean? Sloops are not really up to it, or would it just be considered worth the gamble? It would be a gamble, but it'd be worth it. Alex Hunt, hello! Trent Delanco. There were lots of problems with RAF radar in Singapore. There was no VHF ground-to-air radio telegraphy, which in the UK was considered essential if the successful ground control of fighters. I agree there are limitations to it. It's definitely not going to be as good as Chain Home, but it's still better than nothing. And also, the VHF system could probably... I haven't put it as being fixed in this scenario, but there were sets around in terms of lots of VHF sets were sitting in the stores for the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Armed Forces, which had been set up and had been using VHF sets for a few years by this point. So, they were sitting in the naval stores. If you had a Supreme Commander, he could have gone, we have sets, you fit them in those aircraft. But they belong to... I don't care which service they belong to, they get fitted into those aircraft now. And this is the thing. If you have a Supreme Commander there, you can sort out a lot of the issues you have there. The issue you have with forming 29th Brigade is not 28th Brigade. It's not with form, but how integrated and able to work out with each other. For example, Army 2020 meant entire brigades had to retrain. I agree to an extent, but also that brigade is a fairly proficient at jungle fighting. This was the earlier thing. The statement was that they, when I said they were good at jungle fighting, people going, they weren't. They were good at jungle fighting, and they would have been quite capable at it. And I'm sorry, I'm just not. There is a reason I've detached them off from the Indian Division and moved them south, from the 11th Division and moved them south, because I think, honestly, employed with the Australians, the British division which comes in, and whatever remains of the Indian divisions, hopefully all 5 brigades of the, but all 3 brigades, but definitely the 2 brigades already down there of the 9th Division, on the defensive lines would provide a very, very strong formation for defending those areas. It's France's fault. Having well-trained and internally coherent forces is only part of the battle. Even if the whole force of Malaya were well-trained and experienced, without good organization and planning, they're still in bother. Yes, I agree, which is why, again, the big change is having the supreme commander who can command and control everything and is of sufficient political clout they can command and control things. Just a random question to the 85 people who we have watching. Thank you for watching. How are you finding this this format? Is it working well for you? Have I been freezing a lot? I don't think I have, but I have to be sort of careful, and I'm sort of watching that system, and I'm watching this and going, "Oh, what's going on?" Look at BF, well trained and equipped, but it collapsed because events overran them. They couldn't corner it. Yes, they couldn't. The nicest way, though, my theory is that if you'd had a decent enough time, it would have worked quite well. Yes. Blue Ship Buddha. If Prince of Wales and Repulse had survived the December 10th attack, they would have operated as part of Abda, and they would have probably operated the US Asiatic Fleet, or probably gone on to operate with the British Eastern Fleet when it was formed up pretty much immediately after they were sunk. You know, it was very quickly there was an Eastern Fleet formed. This is one of the things which I find funny when people go, the British couldn't supply enough ships out there. Well, they couldn't before there was an attack. The moment there's a war, there's a fleet very quickly formed up in the Indian Ocean. Very, very quickly. Miss not seeing the bottle collection. Well, we can sort of change that a bit. There you go. You can see some of the bottle collection and a certain person peering through. Ay, caramba. And book collection and all sorts of other things up there. I usually do that to cover up the messy part, but also because it's just nice having it there. Right. Bam, bam, bam. Okay. Slim had similar issues with poor forces being able to hold off against an army with the initiative, so I could see Singapore being held if someone just pulled the finger out. That's the point. And these officers aren't necessarily bad. If you had Heath in charge of your defensive line, it would have been a well-coordinated line. And if there'd been enough... Percival is very good at the staff work. He's very good at logistics. He's very good at managing those things. So if you use him in that role as your army commander, coordinating stuff to supply forward to Heath, he becomes very, very useful. If you let Ivan Simpson do his job and do his work to conducting defenses, you would have had a fortified line which would make the dwarfs out of Lord of the Rings happy. That's the sort of thing. I notice occasional freezing for about 1 second. Usually if you have been waving your hands around, this suggests the laptop is limited. Yeah, but laptop seems to be working okay. Definitely wouldn't support a second screen, I think. Mm-hmm. Hello, butter bottles formerly containing iron brew and substitute furry research assistant. Yes, a substitute furry research assistant. The UK do need to celebrate Slim more. He is a very, very good general. He's a very good general. Steam White, risk pulling down resources. In the nicest way, that's what a risk pulling down resources with Turbot, Sarnos, and Nazo start there near the Atlantic. What's that take? 6 or more BBs to cover? In the nicest way, the British end up, if you can't discount, of course, repulse and Prince of Wales. So, but in my scenario, they survive. The British send Warspite, 4 R-class battleships, all concentrate on the Indian Ocean. So if you have Prince of Wales and repulse, you can have 7 battleships. Well, 7 capital ships. 6 battleships and a battlecruiser. You have 2 carriers end up out there anyway. You have X number of destroyers and cruisers end up out there anyway. This is what's already formed into the Eastern Fleet. The Royal Navy do not go, we lose 4C and then abandon the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean gets, under Admiral Somerville, a huge fleet put out there. So, this is not anything which wasn't actually done anyway. Just this scenario, Singapore is kept hold of. Thomas Rottler, there was one Blenheim night fighter squadron. Planes were knackered. They were Mark 1 Blenheims. Buffaloes had radio, but reception was poor. Atmospherics could make it worse, range 9 miles. Yeah, so, they have them, but you have... And you do have, as I said, Navy sets which are better. Again, you need someone in charge to go, take them, do that. Vigilant, when considering how long Russians held on at Port Arthur in 1904, then later the British at Hong Kong, America's about hand, the relatively swift British collapse of Malaya and Singapore is amazing. It is, and it all speaks about their organisation. Nick Waters, sitting here, the little knockoff Iron Brew, better than nothing, you poor man, but it is better than nothing. That it is. Jay Richardson, Douglas Clark, tis France's fault. Sorry, we need to celebrate Neil Ritchie more. The Forgotten Army has become such a topic of history recently. The entire Italian campaign has been forgotten. The British are very good at forgetting a lot of their campaigns in history. It's France's fault. It's got to be said, Singapore is probably the thing that annoyed me the most about World War II. It just felt like utter negligence. Yeah, it is. Especially when you realise the Japanese would have run out of supplies 2 days later. Basically 2 days of supplies is what they have left. Alex Hunt, given the relatively slow speed of the R-Class, how useful would they have been in containing the water, in contesting the waters around Malaya? The interesting thing is those waters around Malaya aren't exactly that massive or wide. So in the nicest way, if you're turning up in force, and this is the thing, under this scenario, if you do carry on and if you do actually are able to wait and using Prince of Wales and Repulse, you then have a flying squadron of 2 battleships, battle cruiser, and 2 aircraft carriers, hopefully, in order to take on the Japanese. And you also have 4 battleships, older ones, and an older aircraft carrier, Hermes, or is it Hermes or Eagle? I think it's Hermes. I think it is. You have that, you have the old to form as your second group, and in a nicer way, in the combined waters, in confined waters, they're going to be okay. They're going to be useful. Or you could be using those R-Class to battle against the Japanese land defenses, forcing their navy to have to come to their land troops, to force their navy to come in and help, and keep the flying, fast-moving group out of the way, and just bring them in to go, hello, Japan, you didn't realize we were here. That's the sort of scenario you're talking about. Let's see if that works. Hang on. I can stop. Oh, this is the floppy research system. No, that's very recent. There we go. There you go. I don't like to keep you out because you're such a camera hog. Right. I would pull Jeff Beeler. I would pull Montgomery and build up my 3 divisions to full 3 brigade strength on the 3rd Corps and send Bennett home. Let Heath fight Japanese and on the beaches in Siam. That sounds lovely, but where are you going to get those troops from? Where are you going to get the supplies from? And you're not going to get Montgomery. It would be a lovely idea, but it's not going to happen. Montgomery's too useful to the army. They're not going to send him out unless it's a full-on war. This is the thing. The army is going to send their good officers where there is actual fighting, and where they think there's just going to be peacetime shenanigans. They're going to send their officers which are okay to moderate. Lost bar. Yeah. To Andy Folds, Disposable. That's because it was Percival knew the situation because he wrote the threat assessment and he had the highest authority. He just didn't exercise it. He didn't have the highest authority. Technically, that was Popham Brooke, who had the highest authority but couldn't really do anything about it. And Percival could have done it, but he didn't exercise it. I know. I do. Bishron, my Imperial War Museum HMS Belfast guidebook I just got shows Coca-Cola in the canteen, but no iron brew. It's terrible. It is a problem time. It was Hermes. Steam White. Narrow water capping T main danger. The main danger. Defender has the advantage. Benlor. Percival should have been in London in the Imperial General Staff, not Singapore. Probably. Jeff Beeler. How fast did the RN get submarines to the area? They could have got them there a lot quicker if they'd wanted to. This is the thing. They could have gotten. They had 6 in the area, as I've said. Could have had 6 in the area. Basically, I said that exercising his role as Supreme Commander, Keyes would have kept hold of them. Keyes would have probably demanded more submarines and got them quite quickly. So they could have added another 6 or so to that area, especially if they'd taken some from the Mediterranean and some from the Atlantic. It wouldn't have been perfect. The Royal Navy's always short of submarines in World War II because they get sunk because they've got issues and all those things going on. They're fighting an actual war elsewhere, but they would have got some more. So you probably have seen them go up to 6 or so, but you'd have also probably seen some American submarines get transferred to Singapore quite quickly, which would have been if they'd held for longer. And the Americans would have wanted to keep Singapore supplied to keep their particular convoy, their submarine supplied. So the Americans would have probably taken on quite a lot of the burden of making sure that Singapore had plenty of convoy supplies coming in. Disposable. I meant Harold Alexander. Damn mustaches makes me confuse them. It confuses me half the time as well, honestly, if I'm being honest about them. There are so many different generals of so many different ranks doing so many weird stuff. There you go. Sorry, I know the reason he's peering. There is a reason he's peering out. It's my little. It's to say hi to my little cousins who swear they always see something fluffy in the background when I look at these. So you know. Bitchron, Japanese massacre a lot of Chinese residents in Malaya. They do. They are very, very happy to kill off anyone. Alexander, what would you use submarines for in Malaya? I would be having them operating from Singapore, and I would be turning the South China Sea, and especially the Raoul area, into a nightmare. So the Raoul Islands would be getting completely the sort of center area of that map would be getting dominated by submarines, so the Gulf of Thailand and the Java Sea. If I have submarines operating from Singapore, I have a large control over that area. Costranus, what was the deal with the Wavell in the region? My understanding is that he just showed up at Palembang too late to do anything. Pretty much, that's exactly it. There is a reason why I have him in the photo with Brooke Popham. Popham Brooke. Double barrel names. Never know. No fall of Singapore makes Malaya an emergency less likely as well. Yep. A bit more what if, Daniel Freeman. What if the Italians didn't join in World War II and then RN isn't having to fight in the Mediterranean as well Atlantic? Or the French Navy decamped to North Africa? Well, in that case, if you're not having to fight the Italians, then frankly, the Royal Navy fleet that comes to the Far East in about 1941-ish, probably in November time, is quite a hefty chunk of what was in the it was in the Mediterranean. Probably aircraft carriers and battleships, quite a lot of them. So there's quite a hefty force probably then sitting in that area. Again, if I had my way, I would be basing on Ceylon, but they'd probably been based at Singapore. But they would have been a far larger force. C1, USA spent a huge amount to keep open the Burma Road. Singapore would have kept that problem from arising. Yep. Jarek, Belnora, and without Japanese unconquest of DA, also Indonesian independence war. Interesting. Pat W, have to run. Enjoyed the presentation. My fuzzy grilling assistant send the greetings to the fluffy research assistant. That's good. The fluffy research assistant is getting annoyed that he hasn't been part of any of the morning recordings yet recently because simply because he hasn't been up here when I've been recording them. He's been elsewhere. He's mainly been he goes and sits in other rooms, and then I do the recording, and then he comes in after I finish the recording and sort of sits on the bed and goes, "We're not doing a recording today." No. Jerison, any comments being censored? Not as far as I know. But it's going to sound strange. I'm watching it on the live chat feed on the phone, whereas I normally watch it on the huge chat feed on the computer, and I can't really see what's being censored or anything on the computer, on the phone, like I can on the computer. So there could be stuff being censored, and I just don't see it. I'm sorry. Because I'm watching this by watching the joy that is my streaming live, and basically I've managed to make this work by not having the chat filter on it. I found that if I had the chat going up and down it as well as the video and the pictures, it overloaded it. So I decided, what did I really want? Well, I quite like talking to you, and I think it's a good thing if you can see my face chatting away with you, because that allows me to add intonation and things to what I'm saying, so that you can get all the non-verbal cues about what I'm saying. And I wanted the pictures, so that meant the chat had to go. Alex Hunt, so use the subs for commerce rating rather than the specific defense of Malaya. They would be part of the defense of Malaya, because they would make the joy of bringing any amphibious task group or any carriers nearby very, very painful. But they wouldn't be specifically sitting around Malaya going, "Hello, you've arrived off the coast. You've arrived off the shore of Malaya." They would also, and this is the thing that they would be part of. They would probably be there in case the ones which would be in refit, etc., would be back in getting resupplied in Singapore. Would probably be involved if anyone tried to do an amphibious assault on Singapore. Would probably go out and quickly deal some death if they're going around. Right. So they would be on supply interdiction. They'd be on commerce warfare. They'd be doing all those sort of things, Alex. Regards Iron Trent Tranker. Regards Iron Suns in Real Islands. Sarek fell in January, and IJN seaplanes would be operating there. They would be, but IJN seaplanes weren't exactly the best at anti-submarine warfare. They weren't terrible, but they weren't the best either. And I have a feeling that if you have the submarines operating there from the beginning, you probably find that the Japanese have a lot of trouble supplying them. Andy Fold, holding Singapore also most likely prevents the Bengal famine. I can't say whether it prevents or not, but it would certainly probably make it far less of a famine. It would be a starvation more than a famine, and Now, that sounds terrible. Those are sort of sometimes used technical terms, but a famine involves in a huge number of deaths. A starvation usually is far less deaths, and it will be possibly be more able to be easily dealt with. Also, in a nice way, if you have what's going on there. If Singapore doesn't fall, you don't have the Japanese operating in the Bay of Bengal. If the Japanese fleet isn't really operating in the Bay of Bengal, you can then use your your slower coastal steamers to move a lot of your trade around India, so you can get a lot of supplies up. Even though you still do not have the infrastructure across India, you can still move supplies around. So that's going to probably make the famine less likely as well. Jeff Beeler, Air Chief Marshal problem had a Staff 7 does not seem to be actually have the authority to command anything. Subcommands could still appeal to higher civil military staffs. Yes. As I said, the whole point of him is I do not know what. He has no power. He is technically supposed to coordinate, and he has no staff. It would only have been tolerated by Popham. Popham in this way, Roger Keyes had been out there as Supreme Commander. God help them. He'd have had a staff of a couple of hundred within about 5 minutes, probably knowing him. He probably turned up with a staff of a couple hundred. Mm-hmm. Jeff Beeler. Jeff Beeler, sadly, not even Slim could hold Burma with Gurkhas and tanks even. No, he couldn't, but there again, the Japanese could concentrate all their forces on him and everything on him. If they're having to fight still down in Singapore and Malaysia, then they can't concentrate as much forces on them. So, you know. Jerison, I'm trying to ask a question on captured facilities equipment. I think it's being censored as spam for some reason. Oh. That is the other thing, again. The Japanese do capture a lot of supplies and a lot of fuel at Singapore. And most importantly, they capture ship infrastructure, which allows them to operate their fleets this far south. Singapore is critical for fleet operations for the Japanese in this region. So if you prevent them capturing Singapore, then their fleet is pushed that much further north. Tom Trotter, lots of books on Malaya Singapore campaign. Which do you recommend? Honestly, there's none of them I really like. Let me get back to you on that one. Ask me on the brew ships. I'll go and have a look at them. Ask me on the brew ships this week. Doing Supreme Super Command, but Superpowers, but I'll have a look before then. Martin Doherty, the best book I read was the Defense and Fall of Singapore 4042 by Brian Farrell. Tempting. It's a good one, but I'm not so keen on some of its things. Carmen Gasbert, and there is the opportunity of showing or even drawing a picture on the face cam window if the need arises. Tempting. Martin Target, Justice Clark. It's Mysteries of Deep on tonight. Just want to keep the discussion up. It's on Thursday. Jeff Beeler in the UK. I think it's on Wednesday in America. Jeff Beeler, a better defense of Malaya means less attention to the New Guinean area and maybe no Midway. You can always hope. Danny Frim, Justice Clark. Apparently the Singapore base had enough fuel to supply the whole RN for 6 months. Yes, it did. This is the thing. In a nice way, if you have the supplies, if you can keep sell to Singapore, it's amazing what the British and what everyone can suddenly do. Singapore is built as an infrastructure hub. Steve White, 39 B-17s MacArthur had was the largest USA concentration of bombers at the time. Well, against one Japanese airbase would have been effective. It could have been. Alex Hunt, to expand the counterfactual, what do you think Japanese High Command will do if Singapore holds? Pull back or commit their battleships? I think the IJA only asked the IJN for help probably in late January. I think the IJN turns up in late January, probably with the Kido Batai, maybe the Rego Batai, the battleships. I probably just mangled their name, and I think they turn up, and I think they try and fight. But the thing is, also they're going at that point. If they do, There are going to be all the Allied forces are probably going to concentrate it underneath Phillips' command, and there's going to be a large fleet sitting there at Singapore. So that's their options. Their options is either send a large fleet out down to Singapore or not. Either withdraw or send a large fleet. I think they gamble and send a large fleet, but I think then they might win the battle. They might even take Singapore, but they'll probably lose a lot of ships and a lot of things in the process, which means they're going to be very, very weak by the time the Americans are back to full strength. Conversely, they also might not win enough. They might lose. There's always a chance against Phillips and Keyes, and maybe Somerville gets sent out there by that time. Who knows? But there's always a chance that they don't win. And they don't win because there are a concentration of land air forces, there's a concentration of the naval forces and all these things, and they get caught at night. And if they get caught at night and they get damaged and they lose, then the Japanese have lost their naval strength. The army still haven't taken Singapore, and now you have a very different World War II. But that is pushing it on quite a bit. That's the reason I stopped it at the end of February. 2RC, second in RC in the British and Singapore are given a lot of captured equipment, Italian equipment, captured Italian equipment. Yes, they do. They do have a lot of captured Italian equipment, but it still works. Thomas Fry, the Japanese also capture a lot of Penang and various airfields in northern Malaysia. Yes, so again, that's why you have the supplies all down in Singapore. You stop giving the Japanese supplies. That would have probably actually made the Japanese run out of supplies a lot earlier. If you had been keeping your supplies down in Singapore and operating from Singapore as your main base and withdrawing to the defensive lines and not having all these supplies pushed around the whole of Malaysia, the Japanese would probably run out of supplies a lot earlier. Does Clark, Alexander Freeman? Interesting question. The issue is whether they can overcome the Army Navy slip to assist, but the IJN do need the oil. They do, but the thing is, it's going to be a battle. It's going to be an internal battle as well. Back in a second. Keeps wanting to skip onto that, doesn't it? Right then. Jerry, what I'm trying to say is there an attempt to put the facilities and equipment out of action, i.e. Leanne feels there is an attempt, but it's not really. There's not enough going on. That's the question. That's the real thing. There isn't enough going on. They don't do enough to do it. You could have done far more, but they don't. All right. Ooh. I'm not going to look down. I'm going to keep looking up, but I am moving the questions so I can read them easier because they're coming quite thick and fast. Right then. So, could one turn around the discussion around what did the Japanese get right to capture Malaya and Singapore? They managed to coordinate their forces. They managed to concentrate where the British and Allied forces were weak, and they managed to keep up a constant pace of assault so that the British never got a chance to catch and hold their breath. They took advantage of every weak spot the British had very successfully. And they bluffed. They managed to consistently bluff the British that they were stronger than they were. They really did. So they do it well. You know, in the nicest way, the Japanese don't get much wrong in the campaign from their perspective of what they could do with the resources they had available. The British get a lot wrong with the resources they have available. Tony Penfold, American subs no effect due to Mark 14 torpedoes. Well, that's the other thing. Singapore has a rather large stock of British torpedoes, which are slightly different to the American ones, but are about broadly the same size, and they do work. Vision, how much was racism an issue? The USA did not have a high opinion of the Japanese, didn't think they could still see in the dark, and didn't think they could see in the dark, and were afraid of bats till they became a sort of after 12th December. 7th December. Okay. Some people, you certainly do have an opinion based on the racial stereotyping and white superiority. Others who have had a closer experience of the Japanese are far less likely to it. Interesting enough, there is another name who's out there who's attached to the Air Forces Command in the Far East in the previous times, not at that time, but a guy called Cave Brown Cave, Wing Commander Cave Brown Cave, who is very, very respectful of the Japanese. Again, most of the Royal Navy naval officers, most of them, especially ones who've served in the Far East, have a far greater respect for the capabilities of the Japanese. This is another reason why a naval officer as Supreme Commander, i.e. like Roger Keyes, is better, because they deal with the realities, not the myth. And there are lots of people prepared to deal with the myth, the idea of superiority, versus the reality of Japanese strength. And as Disfrontis said, has put, yes, that is a good question, Thomas. Don't think there are some good vids on this from Military History Visualized on one of his channels. So you might. Manila had enough material for turning millions of gallons of aviation fuel into 100 octane. Had to destroy. Yeah, you could have done that. Mm-hmm. Sure, Mac, Dr. Clark. Was it because of my idea to use counterfactual as term opposed to what if or alternative history? Yes, it was, but also I have used the term counterfactual before, and I rather like it. Counterfactual is a nice way to think of it because I am not trying to do what if history. I am not trying to do fantasy history. I am trying to do looking at look at the facts, but look at them in a slightly different methodology, so we can sometimes instance. And the point is, you can better illuminate what happened with the British forces if you go and look at it from the perspective of what would have happened if you had changed that commander, if you had changed one thing. So I didn't change anything in terms of the structures. I didn't change anything in terms of the senior officers. Yes, some would have been promoted to the Supreme Commander staff. That would have made them slightly freer, so that's minor changes. But the fact is, by having the Supreme Commander out there, you suddenly have things. Calvin Gasberg, did the IJN have small ships along the lines of Osprey TT and E-boats? Shidori and Notary class are way bigger category and way less numerous. They have a few, but not many. They really don't have many. Alazowski, read somewhere that the Japanese named one of the airfields as Churchill Strip to thank for all the gifts they found there. Is it true? It's one of the jokes that goes around, certainly. But there were a lot of stuff left in Singapore. There's a lot of stuff left in the whole of Malaya, and that's another trouble. You have all these air bases which have all this stuff in it. The stuff's been mostly put there since April 1941. It's just, no. If I had been Percival, or if Roger anyone had about there sensible, it would have been a case of withdraw it to Singapore, where we can defend it. Tick Masters at Thomas Rottler. I think Singapore was a British defeat more than a Japanese victory. As Simon says, Just a few days more. Simon? A few days more and the Japanese would run out of supplies. Simon? I'm Alex. But I have said it. Simon, there might be a Simon in here, actually. Might have missed a Simon. But no, it's Alex. Engaging strategy. Hello. All right then. Paul Johnson. Would the Japanese have kept trying to take Singapore if Alice hadn't surrendered? If do so, for how long? Well, their own supplies would have run out with a couple of days after February. So, in a nice way, if you had managed to keep the fighting going past about February the 20th, the Japanese army would have run out of supplies. The 25th Army would have run out of supplies. So either they'd have drawn or they'd have had to be resupplied. And they'd probably run out of supplies earlier if they hadn't have found all the supplies at the air bases they did. They would probably kept trying, but they might have been forced back. Jeff Beeler, most of the British seem to have afflicted with the bad case of this can't be happening instead of getting on the job. Then there's Bennett. Yeah. Bennett does all sorts of things weird. He can be a very good commander. Engage Tony. With respect to 4C, do you think Phillips had Phillips pressed on after being detected that he could have still have gotten amongst the invasion forces? Was it a mistake to run given the nature of the gamble? Yes. The nicest way, you can't outrun an aircraft, so you might as well go all in. If you can't outrun them, you go all in on it. Trying to run, you can't run. But I honestly think 4C was placed in an impossible position. As I've said, they should never have been there. I would have kept the fleet. If Rogers had been in charge, the fleet would have been kept back at Ceylon. I'm sure about that. Roger Keyes had been kept in charge. The fleet would have been kept back in Ceylon. If I'd been in charge, if anyone sensible to charge, you'd form the fleet up on Ceylon and bring them into Singapore as needed. You would have kept heavy cruisers and things centered on Singapore. Disresponsible. Any subsequent defended attack on Singapore would have been better than what happened in reality. Yeah. Vision. On the Commonwealth Allied force against Italy in Africa in 1940? See, might wonder why the English expert like General Humour went against the Americans while Yamaguchi got Singapore. Was the Tiger in Malaya already famous? I think in his case, it was that was considered the less serious threat. They knew how the British were laid out, and they didn't really have. In the nicest way, thanks to an incident where a ship was found on supply lines, they knew how weak the British were in Malaya, and they knew more importantly that the British were not well organised. Bishop, the Japanese army won in the Malaya in the way the army of North Virginia won against the army of the Pontiac. For example, Lee versus McClellan in the Peninsula Campaign, or Grant during the Vicksburg Campaign. Yes, you have the fact that if your enemy is falling apart or is completely disorganized and is fighting a different battle than you are fighting, it does give you an advantage. Shomak, I really like counterfactual as a term because it sounds more academic than what if or alternative history, and also emphasizes the role of illustrating why people did what they did by going through events. And that's the thing. That's why I started off by looking at what actually happened, and then I go, right, and here's the change. And it was very important for me when I was looking at this change was I was making the minimal changes. I wasn't suddenly adding in a whole load of forces. I wasn't moving anyone who was heavily committed. And that's the thing with Montgomery. I would love to send him out there. I would love for Montgomery to be out there. I would love for Slim to be out there. But the trouble is they're doing jobs which were considered more important at the time. So it has to be someone who could be excused from their role. Roger Keyes is about the only example of someone who could be excused from their role, who is active, mean, as you would put it. And yes, he might be a little on the old side, but actually that makes deploying him as Supreme Commander even better because in the nicest way, it's a good post to send him to. It gives him, basically, it could be considered by some as a retirement post, but by him, it certainly wouldn't be. Engage something. Martin Stevens' book, Scapegoat, opposes the theory that Prince of Wales and Repulse were pushed forward with Phillips as a prelude to becoming the centrepiece in a new Abda fleet. Is there much credence to this? In a nice way, they weren't really forming the Abda fleet at this point. There were always talks about it, but it didn't get formed. I would myself. They're pushed forward because the landings are going on in Malaya and the army's bleeding. It's Crete, it's Dunkirk, it's Nemesis. The army's bleeding, the air force is bleeding, the navy's not prepared to stand by and let them bleed. You have a destroyer officer, a career destroyer officer, so naturally, innately baked in enemy's aggression in terms of fleet actions. And in Destroyer's first rule of her thing is it doesn't matter how big the enemies you're facing, you can't fight them if you run away from them. You can only fight them and have a chance of surviving if you run towards them. You know, there's glowworm and all sorts of instances which show that. So Phillips was in a position he was put in Singapore even with the limited forces, he was always going to do that. Interesting question would be what would happen if the battleships had been held back. Prince of Wales and Repulse be held back in Ceylon with the R-class and all these things as sort of these battle fleeting being to come out under maybe a vice admiral or a rear admiral, and you'd sent Phillips forward and he'd had cruisers and destroyers. I think in a force of destroyers, 15 or so destroyers going north, he might have had more success, but you know, that's just my instinct. Jeff Beeler, the fact that Tom Phillips had no superior speaks volumes and illustrates the big problem. Yeah, you have no command structure out there. You have no command. You need a supreme commander. And you need him appointed in about April 1941. You need someone out there actually in freaking charge. This is the big problem. There's lots of people who all think they're in charge and then aren't doing anything or don't want stuff done because of some reasons. Oh, I don't want these areas marked up because it would cost money. Well, again, Roger Keyes, there is a war on. This is why you send out someone like that. It's just the whole thing. When I was looking through Malaya, when I was looking at all these scenarios, sorry, this is what I'm using to hold it up. I've got a nice little stand. This is what I'm using. And by the way, I will still be using the phone for cruise ships because the camera I think is still actually slightly better than even the new one, and because then I can have the chat on the computer screen and I can see everything going on that, which is far better for cruise ships, which is far more a chatty conversational one. These ones I think I can just about do this way. I don't know. Just Francis, think about the money later. Yeah, that's the point. You're fighting a major war. Was the engaging China? Was the issue that Percival was notionally in charge, but generally failed to behave like he was? Yes. Percival tries to be a consensus leader, like Admiral Noble would be, but Admiral Noble was a consensus leader who got his way. Percival was a consensus leader who didn't get anything done because he couldn't bring consensus. Noble used to be king of the would you just wait a moment while after everyone's gone, and he would have dealt with Gordon Bennett by having a nice one-to-one conversation. It's just silly what's going on sometimes. Andy Folds, you need a new laptop, Alex. Well, if I'm being quite honest at the moment, there are a lot of things I need a new of, and sorting out all sorts of things. But it's a case of this laptop has seen me through a book, and I had one laptop for my PhD, and I've had one laptop for this book, which has been about 4 years of research. And then after the books was out published, and then now I'm going to start saving for a new laptop. But I always buy a decent laptop, so usually it lasts me 4 or 5 years of hard usage. At the moment, what I really need is to set it up with a second, is to have a computer which will take a second screen properly. But the trouble is, the laptop won't. So the book goes in. I have to say a big thanks to Drakenfernel, because he has managed to sort out my picture issue for the book, which was holding the book up. So everything should go in. The book should all go in this week now. Pictures, everything combined. It was supposed to go in yesterday, but I had all sorts of issues keep happening yesterday. But it's all combined. Everything's done. The writing's all done. The pictures are all going to be organised and sorted, and everything's going to go in either probably tomorrow at this rate. So anyway, read Churchill's History of the English People. Actually, one of the first English things thrown into CD. And see this more as a gigantic brawl. First modern war on many levels, yet Napoleonic at the start. I think that's Stephen White. That's coming from your discussion about the American Civil War or American War of Revolution. Right. So it's almost 9 o'clock. If we are sort of petering out of questions, I might end this at 9 o'clock with a big thank you to all my subscribers, and thank you to all my patrons, because you're making everything actually work at the moment. If it wasn't for my patrons, I wouldn't be able to buy half the books. I wouldn't be able to buy any of the books, basically, I'm buying at the moment, because all my hours are being cut. I'm down to, due to COVID-19. I'm a contract lecturer, so thank you very much. And thank you very much to the subscribers, because that's very, very cool. I'm now at over 4,000, 4,120 something when I last looked. And that's amazing, frankly. I'm very surprised about that. And thank you to all the people who are pre-ordering my book. You're keeping my publishers very, very happy. And thank you to everyone who is on the Discord, because that's lovely chats. I'm enjoying the chats there. I'm glad you've all found this interesting. Thursday is Tribals, Battles and Darings. So Thursday is Tribals, Battles and Darings, okay? I know I've said that twice, but I'm really excited about it. It's Tribals, Battles and Darings. And if we go through quickly to the end, what we've got coming up. This one, we've got Back Pocket Cruisers, done properly. The Tribal Battle and Daring Class Destroyer story. So that's going to be basically a taster of what's in the book, but not the full stuff that's in the book, of course, because there's only so much I can get in here, whereas I can get a lot more in 80,000 words. And it's in Happy's Patreon video. What would you put in Warehouse at the end of World War I for World War II, and why? I'm not sure if I'm going to do any introduction videos for that, or if I'm just going to do a straight video like this. But I might do an introduction video, because it's going to be interesting. What would I put in the Warehouse at the end of World War I for World War II? Flying boats and seaplanes, yes. Some more admirals, engineers, and histories. Basically, expect to hear a lot about this guy in that one, Gorshkov, and how the Russian way of war is developed. Very bad accents going on here. Naval diplomacy. And we have the Indian Ocean from 1941 to 43. So that's going to be more about this. Basically, what happens because Singapore falls. And some from the sea stuff. How naval power has been used to influence land campaigns. And making Mare Nostrum a hollow jest. RN submarines have been a topic today. They're going to be a topic on the 20th of July. Thank you, Kevin Target. And so basically, and this is the stuff where you can find me. Naval History Live, of course, on Twitter and on Patreon. Twitter is AC_Naval History. And Global Maritime History. All sorts of stuff. All right. Daniel Freeman, thank you. I'm glad it's been lovely and interesting. Thank you. Bitron, thanks. Books Conflict of Interest, Art and War in Modern Japan has lovely prints 1894 of Japanese battles and military affairs from the collection of St. Louis Army Museum. Oh, cool. Paul Johnson, how much was Churchill involved in appointing commanders, hence playing for the fall of Singapore? Unfortunately, he was very, very involved. They were all people he liked. but they're also, in the nicest way, they weren't people he necessarily needed back in the commanders are extent. Phillips especially are people he's liked, and Phillips is not necessarily a bad choice. It's just he's sent out there with a force which is totally inadequate for what he needs to do. You either sharp with a full force, or you don't sharpen with it. You know, it's the worst thing you can do in naval deterrence is sharp with a weak force. You just look you with a sort of an obviously weak force. If you sharp with a couple of extra cruisers, you look really confident because we're just deploying cruisers because we don't need to deploy anything else. If you sharp with a couple of battleships, you show you can't deploy any more battleships, and that's the whole point. If you don't sharp with full battle fleet, you can't do it. Also, one thing, the discussion system is the link down bottom. So if you're a patron, there is a link down below you can click on, and that's where the system where you can suggest topics for August. So like the Unhappy one and the CIA one, that's where you can suggest for August. Jaderson, good as ever. Walkie's time. I also have to walk the fluffers simply for getting the wrong card and near heart attack has it run off. Ooh. Baylor, put a question in the Patreon one. I just love the ironclad HMS Terror. Thank you. I know. Eric Akin, thank you very much for your stream. Very good. Can I get a signed book from you somehow? We might sort out, but that's the book when it comes out in December. We'll sort that out then. Nicest way. At the moment, I'm dealing with enough paperwork now, and I've got to at some point have a chat with sort out some good old tax issues. Probably knowing my luck. Trouble with being employed by multiple universities. PAYE and government tax doesn't really work. Anyway, what was Britain's response to the Japanese occupation of Vietnam? They didn't really like it, but they couldn't do anything about it. Paul Johnson, will that mean Thursday's chat will last until around midnight? Probably not, because Thursday's chat could last till midnight, but Thursday, unfortunately, you always have to remember it's Mysteries of the Deep. So I go downstairs and I usually watch that in the evening. So chat usually on a Thursday ends at about 8:30. But if you're all very nice to me, I might begin Thursdays early at about 5:30, so you still get the full 3 hours. The book, I think there is a link down to it, but it's Tribals, Battles, and Darings, The Genesis of the Modern General Purpose Destroyer. It is available on Amazon. I'm not sure if it's available elsewhere. Steve White, need meaningful odd ships. US Canvas, I had a tanker that one die. Oh, yeah, that's always good to have odd ships. Then, as per Andy Folds, you need a link to your book to the pre-order. I think they're down below. If I haven't put one, I will put one down there at some point. Take care. Thank you, Blue Ship Butter. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Tis Francis Fault. Thank you, Eamon. Tis Francis. Oh. At Eamon, Tis Francis. I meant the occupation of French Indochina in 1941. Yeah, it's fun times. The British respond, but the British can't do much about it. Burnham, had Singapore been held and the British not had that massive defeat, what do you think the effect would have been post-colonial time? Would Singapore have been another Hong Kong? Singapore is their own state, so it's kind of interesting. The possibility is, would Singapore have stayed part of Britain? There was always often the consideration, and this is the thing. There are the roots not gone. What would have happened if Britain had gone through the possibility of giving Malta, Singapore membership in Britain and putting MPs in the House of Commons and those sort of things and become part of Britain? Would they have stayed part of Britain? Would they have? How that affected Britain? How that affect Britain as as it being the world? So it'd be interesting possibilities, but it might have just gone the same as it did. Take care, Kevin. Take care, Jack. Take care, Greg. Thank you. Eric Ocken, available on Medi Nordic online source. I have your book saved on Albert. No, that's good to know. Constant housing, Singapore part of Malaysia in the 60s. 63 to 65. Yeah. But they do get sort of independence. It's how things get sort of organised post World War II is a sort of interesting scenario. It all depends. There's lots of different things which could go in there. Anyway, right. take care. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'm now going to end the stream. So I'm going to end the stream properly by disappearing that, waving goodbye. Take care. Thank you very much. Disappearing that. And you still need to tell us about Phillips. I'll be nice. I'll quickly do Phillips. Okay, so Phillips is one of those officers who has a bit of a career, and that he has worked pretty hard to get there, and he is come up through destroyers. He's been promoted quickly because he's had a lot of exposure to senior officers, but he actually was a very successful destroyer officer and a very successful rear admiral destroyers. He's then been involved in the Admiralty, and honestly, he gets out as Admiral Phillips thanks in part to having impressed Churchill with his investigation of the Hood sinking. So, you know, he has a lot of, that's how he gets where he goes. Anyway, that's that from Phillips. Jeffy, also no good way for him to get intel and air support. No air liaison team on board, for example. There was not. He had nothing. Phillips was deployed to a very, very dangerous place with no support, and that's his trouble. Jeffy, that's the thing again. If you send Roger Keyes out there in 1941, it might not get set up in 1940, but it would have got set up in 1941. He would have got set up a joint command, and it would have probably got the Allies involved. Right. Now I am, as I said, I'm off to the fluffy research assistant. So take care. Thank you.